Hey everyone. Today we're going to go ahead and get this started because we have 2 episodes today, but they are really long. And today will be, if we can get through both of these episodes, today will be the last day of streaming our birthday stream, the original podcast series Beyond the Veil. And then, of course, you can continue to go to the Lori Vallow trial playlist, as well as oh, I hear someone. I think I might need to go help someone really quickly. We have a little boy who's home today, not doing too well. He's kind of sick. So I'll get this started and we'll take it from here. Hidden, a true crime podcast. A forensic psychologist and a journalist explore the hidden motives behind unthinkable crimes while examining our deepest fears along the way.
And so through those blessings, through that treachery of going to the temple, and then after I've had this washing over of the Lord, who gave me all of his complete love, all of his peace, which is not of this world.
This is Lauren Matthias.
And I'm Dr. John Matthias.
And who you just heard was Lori Vallow. She was bearing her testimony. That's what Mormons call the personal sharing of spiritual experiences. Usually it's done during a Sunday church service. But here, Lori is bearing her testimony at Melanie Gibbs' home in October 2018. This audio was released last month by Annie Cushing.
After I've had this washing over of the Lord, who gave me all of his complete love, all of his peace, which is not of this world.
Tonight is lucky number episode 13. And what are we talking about, Dr. John?
We'll be talking about love.
Love.
As if our discussion of evil wasn't conceptually loaded enough. Let's just
throw in love.
Let's throw caution to the wind and explore love.
Here's someone else talking about love from an episode of MTV's reality show Catfish.
It was immediate connection, a million I love yous back and forth. It was pretty cool.
This Catfish episode is about a man named Spencer from Knoxville, Tennessee. Spencer claims he's been in a virtual relationship with singer and pop star Katy Perry for 6 years. He's never met her. He has talked to her on the phone once, he says, and it's been 6 years of emails.
Katy's full of life. She's huge heart.
Have you guys said that you love each other?
Many times.
Spencer is as certain as anything that he is in love with Katy Perry, the Katy Perry, and that Katy is in love with him. He's even made her a ring and is ready to propose.
On the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being I fully believe I'm in a virtual relationship with Katy Perry, and 1 being this could be true, but probably isn't, but I thought it would be a good episode of Catfish. Where do you fall on that scale?
Like 1,000. There's definitely love there. I don't have any doubt.
And Lori Vallow, she is certain she has met and seen the resurrected Jesus Christ.
I'll just start by saying that I am a personal witness of the resurrected Jesus Christ. I am his advocate and I am his friend. He is with me.
She has no doubt.
And I was one of his strongest warriors. And I saw it. And he showed me so that I could never deny it again. The Savior is real. I had the love of Jesus Christ who washed over me. There is nothing like that on this earth. It is life-changing.
So let's take this to Dr. John. What do these two, Spencer on Catfish and Lori Vallow, have in common?
At the broadest level, the commonality is perceiving love to be a panacea, perceiving love to be a cure for all our ills, all our problems, all our pains and suffering. It is the perception of love as a cure-all.
As in, Katy Perry would cure all of Spencer's woes, even though we don't know about them. And Christ would cure all of Lori's woes. Is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah, I think the analogy is that Katy Perry, a pop star, a famous and rich pop star, well known with millions of Twitter and Instagram followers, is a secular version of Jesus, potentially. I know that seems like a stretch, but in our culture, pop stars and celebrities take on kind of this secular, larger than life importance. And I think for someone who perhaps isn't as religious, it's quite conceivable to see someone like Katy Perry in the same vein that someone who is very religious might see Jesus Christ.
Okay, taking that in.
Well, there's a couple of commonalities. One is we need to examine the nature of belief. The question here is, how can this guy Spencer, who's never met Katy Perry and can only imagine or create this fantasy of Katy Perry, is how can he believe with certainty that she's in love with him without evidence?
Well, according to Spencer, he has a lot of evidence, and he shows the hosts of catfish all of the evidence, all of the love emails. In fact, he says the lyrics are hints written directly for him.
I've gone back and listened to some of her songs in the last album. All of them have little bits of lyrics that are clues to me. It was up to me to figure it out, but I figured it out. I'm fully 100% confident it's Katie. She's smart, and we are all bearing witness to it coming to fruition. It's Katie. I know it's Katie.
Never mind the fact that she's been dating other people, including dating movie stars during the time that he believes she's in love with him.
Those are just her side boys. She's got her sights set on Spencer, and her song lyrics tell him so.
So part of the issue is, how do we create these beliefs, or oftentimes these abstract beliefs, and then think of them as being realistic?
I have been ministered to by the angel Moroni. I have seen him. I have had lots of angelic ministry with people who wake me up 4 o'clock in the morning and tell me things to do.
For Lori, in order to begin to assess that question, we're going to have to return a bit to an examination of her family.
The Cox family. And when we say Cox family, we mean Lori's family of origin, those who raised her. But before we continue, first we need to share something.
We started this podcast on a whim. We were eating dinner one night talking about the Daybell case that we've been talking about for several months and blogging about to some degree. And we said,
let's do it now or never.
We purchased some equipment, got it out, and we started. Unfortunately, there were a few elements to starting a podcast that we didn't consider because we started so quickly and on a whim. So we had to pause these past few months for a number of reasons, but one of them was because
we had to dot some I's and cross some T's.
Yeah, we had to resolve a few issues before we could move forward. We have done that to the best of our knowledge. So here we are, we're back. But before we start this podcast, we want to make a strong disclaimer, which is this podcast is primarily educational. Although we're talking about a specific case, I think the larger purpose here is to cite research and to present a speculative interpretation of a case that has not gone to court and it has not been adjudicated. And on that issue, as an aside, I should make it very clear that Chad and Lori are innocent until proven guilty, since this case has not gone to trial, although I anticipated that it would have gone to trial much sooner than it appears to be going to trial, that they'll have their day in court and they're both innocent at the moment. So I should make it very clear that this is primarily an intellectual exercise about a particular case. where the defendants may or may not be guilty. I guess we'll find out. Sometimes we make the presumption of guilt, and that's merely a function of the fact that we're speculating. We're running what if scenarios over and over. And the point of that is to give our listeners a sense of how a forensic psychologist might interpret a case.
One reason we wanted to do this is because so many psychologists don't do this. And I told John, I feel like it doesn't help the public to not understand psychology from a psychologist's point of view and what we're discovering about people. And I am so glad that he's sharing his knowledge with us. But we just wanted to say, Chad and Lori are innocent until proven guilty. And as John has said, this is speculative.
Another point I want to make is we don't have all the evidence, nor do we know all the evidence, which also means that we're developing hypotheses and speculating based upon the best of the information that we have. I also told Lauren when we first started this podcast that it actually reminded me a lot of the Alfred plea, which as a forensic psychologist is a type of plea arrangement where a defendant essentially is pleading guilty, but not fully admitting guilt. So the Alfred plea, which began with a case in North Carolina, it was a murder case, actually. Alfred's attorney argued because he was going to be faced with capital punishment or the death penalty, that he accepted a plea against his will. The end result of the Alfred plea and the way it shows up today in almost every state, there are a few states that do not accept an Alfred plea, but they're limited. I think 3 states don't. The way the Alfred plea works today is a defendant can avoid going to trial and they can accept a guilty plea without admitting guilt. A defendant accepting an Alfred plea is saying that they're innocent, but if the case did go to trial, a preponderance of evidence would more than likely find them guilty. For a forensic psychologist, this plea is a nightmare because every time I get in front of someone who's accepted an Alfred plea, their lawyers advise them not to say a word to me. For example, when I ask someone about their history or their crime, they'll say, I didn't commit that crime. And when I ask them to give me some childhood history, they'll say my childhood was great. Many defendants with an Alfred plea refuse to provide information at the advice of their attorneys because they're essentially maintaining the position that they're innocent in spite of the fact that the Alfred plea suggests guilt. How is this relevant to the Daybell case? Because our current speculative interpretations of the case remind me a lot of how I deal with Alfred plea cases, which is to say that because the defendants in those cases don't provide much information, I have to seek information elsewhere. So what I do in those types of cases is I'll go to a spouse or a partner or family members or friends. I have to go to collateral information sources outside of the defendants and outside of the attorney to get valuable information. So I rely almost exclusively on court documents. We call them collateral information sources for information. I think that would be similar here in this case, that if I was hired to go in and evaluate Lori and Chad or both, that more than likely neither of them would provide any useful information about anything. And so the way I would deal with that situation is precisely the way I deal with an Alfred plea case, is I would have to find information elsewhere. So I think in that sense, our interpretation of this case is, to me, it's very much like an Alfred plea because the information from the actual defendants would probably be very limited. And Lauren and I have sought out, to the best of our ability, a number of collateral information sources that know the defendants very well. We have found numerous court documents in addition to Chad Daybell's autobiography and all of his personal writing, which in some ways has provided us with at least as much information as I would get in an Alfred plea case, or probably more. So while I want to make it clear that this is speculative and no plea agreements have been accepted in this case, it does very much remind me of an Alfred plea case. We're not resorting to wild speculation, although we don't know all the evidence. We don't have all the court information or findings or investigative findings. So it is grounded in information we have, but not complete information. And it is very much speculative at this point.
Back to the Cox family. And when we talk about the Cox family, we are talking about Lori's family of origin, the people who raised her, her siblings and her mother and father. That is the Cox family we're talking about here. Barry is her dad, Janice is her mother, Summer is her sister. We'll be mentioning those family members in this episode.
And we talked about their family. We speculated about the fact, based upon the best evidence we had at the time, that Lori's family was what we refer to as a narcissistic family, meaning the dominant member of the family would have been her father, Barry Cox, who tended to be a very extreme and overbearing person in terms of his religious beliefs, his views of the government and the IRS, which he wanted to abolish. In terms of his leadership in the family, we have heard from a reliable source that Barry tended to, quote, rule the family with an iron fist. Barry would be considered very much a dominant figure in this family. He very much controlled the family.
They were an enmeshed family. We speculated, and it is speculation, that there might have been abuse.
We speculated back in episode 9 that perhaps there was some type of abuse in the family. Since that episode, we've received some reliable information that we believe likely confirms that fact, although obviously we have no access to CPS records or reports of any abuse in the family, so it is hypothetical. So let's talk about the nature of belief. How does a belief form? Beliefs, for most of us, begin in our families.
Yes.
They're shaped by the family culture. That's important because we want to look at the Cox family and we want to look at how this family culture influenced Lori's beliefs. I'm going to reference a study by Whitson and Galinsky from Science in 2008. The title of the study is Lacking Control Increases Illusory Pattern Perception. The authors start by stating, quote, the desire to combat uncertainty and maintain control has long been considered a primary and fundamental motivating force in human life and one of the most important variables governing psychological well-being and physical health. The purpose of the study, which involved 6 separate experiments, was to examine the impact of control or lack of control, those were the 2 conditions, on subjects' ability to perceive patterns or to identify patterns in a set of random and unrelated stimuli. What they found was that the participants who lacked control, in other words, they were in the lack of control condition. So there were 2 conditions. There was a group that was primed in several ways to experience a lack of control. And there was another group, the control group, that did not have that. They weren't primed to feel a lack of control. The results showed that the participants who lacked control were more likely to perceive a variety of illusory patterns, including scene images and noise, where no images existed, forming illusory correlations in stock market information, perceiving conspiracies, and developing superstitions. The authors conclude, quote, these 6 experiments demonstrate that lacking control motivates pattern perception. Experiencing a loss of control led participants to desire more structure and to perceive illusory patterns. The need to be and to feel in control is so strong that individuals will produce a pattern from noise to return the world to a more predictable state.
Okay, so is this like conspiracy theories? In other words, what you're saying is when things feel out of hand, we will find patterns in random things. And maybe this is a jump, but
it's related to conspiracy theories. Yeah, they did find that people subject to less control were more likely to see conspiracies, to believe in conspiracy theories.
okay, so that's what I was wondering, because I recently read an article that said that conspiracy theories become more common and more popular among the general public when things are uncertain, like a pandemic or this intense election cycle. I have noticed a lot of conspiracy theories with friends. They seem to be everywhere. And that's what this article was relating it to. In times of uncertainty, there's a rise in conspiracy theories.
And in seeing patterns that don't exist, seeing patterns and random noise is similar to a conspiracy theory, right? Because a conspiracy theory is based upon putting together pieces of a puzzle in a puzzle that doesn't really exist.
Okay. That's helpful to me. And so would you say that somebody that is often looking for patterns in random things, it's wanting to be in control?
Yeah, I think all of us seek some type of control over our environment, but it's a question of degree. When the control becomes really tenuous or fragile, I think maybe some people overcompensate by trying to explain the world simply through conspiracy theories or through seeing patterns that don't exist or developing superstitions. It's a way for us to regain some control over our environment, or at least to feel like we have a valid explanation for all of the uncertainty and for all of the unknown in the environment. And yes, I think our current environment with COVID-19 and all kinds of political uncertainty certainly tends to breed these types of interpretations of the world.
So how does this play into Lori?
Well, let's tie this back to Lori's family.
Okay.
We talked about the Daybell family, and we applied the lens of Robert Beavers, the Beavers model of family functioning. And we said that Chad's family was a mid-range family or a typical family. When we look at the Cox family, though, the evidence seems to point in the direction of seeing the Cox family as what Beavers called a borderline family. So in other words, they're less healthy. A borderline family is not the most dysfunctional family, but it's not a healthy family either. These are some of the characteristics of a borderline family.
Okay.
They shift from chaotic to tyrannical control efforts. Their boundaries fluctuate and they're often poor, but sometimes overly rigid. There's a lot of emotional distance in these families. There's a good deal of depression, and there's outbursts of rage, unpredictable rage in these types of families. Beavers, in a 2000 article published in the Association for Family Therapy, says, quote, borderline families present with chaotic, overt power struggles, alternating with ineffective but persistent efforts to establish dominance or submission patterns. Individual family members have little skill in meeting emotional needs, either their own or those of others. Severely obsessional and anorexic patients may sometimes be found in these families, as well as borderline personality disorders.
And we have both of those in the Coxes. We have Stacy, who we believe was anorexic. She passed away. And Lori, who we believe borderline. And again, we have received additional information since that would claim we're on the right track.
Right. The anorexia was clearly evident with Stacy. We know that from the court documents. Anorexia appears to be possible with the mother, Janice, and there's some possibility that Lori has struggled with anorexia. So that would fit very well. Also, obsessional characteristics, we see that in Barry Cox. He's obsessed with the IRS, with overpowering and abolishing the IRS. It's an absurd undertaking for most of us, for a normal person, but for Barry Cox, there's this obsession. So we see that in the leader of this family.
After he was charged with tax evasion, he then went on years later to write a book that he published, self-published, trying to abolish the IRS. So he didn't necessarily come out of the charges a more humble man, just with more desire to take them down.
We see with Lori a good deal of borderline personality features. I speculated that she likely had borderline personality disorder, and some of that was based on the psychosexual evaluation that was performed on Joe Ryan, where the evaluator interviewed Lori. However, this presentation of being on the extremes and having a great deal of instability in behaviors and emotions and self-image, these are consistent with the type of family that Beavers is talking about here.
Yes. And can we say, if not, we'll edit this out, can we say that you have talked to Colby, to Lori's son, Colby?
Yes, I have had a chance to meet Colby in person. We talked for several hours.
And what was your experience with Colby, or what can you tell us?
I thought Colby was a very genuine person who was simply seeking to make sense of a world that was and has been spiraling out of control for him.
You mentioned to me that you thought he was sincere.
Yeah, I think he really is sincerely searching for answers and direction in the face of this entire fiasco. A lot of what Colby and I discussed is private at the moment. I think it's okay to share. It's reasonable to conclude from my discussions with Colby that Lori does meet many of the criteria for borderline personality disorder.
Okay.
So let's go back. Let's think about the Cox family within the Beavers family systems model. And by the way, the book where Beavers presents much of this research, the summary of a lot of Beavers research can be found in a book called Successful Families, Assessment and Intervention that was published in 1990 with Hampson, for those of you who are curious.
Many people are curious about John's references, and so we're going to try to share those more often in these coming episodes.
So let's go back to the Cox family and think about how beliefs develop and the nature of this family. You have a family culture that's constantly shifting between tyrannical control and chaos, right? This is the perfect environment. This type of inconsistency is the perfect environment to really mess up your kids. It's an environment of uncertainty. It's an environment of fear. It's an environment of unpredictability. So Lori grows up in this environment. Let's go back to the study by Whitson and Galinsky that I referenced earlier, looking at the lack of control and how it affects us. There's a lot of uncertainty in the Cox family. So one natural response to that is to see order in randomness. We talked about this a while back in an episode on Chad where I talked about the idea of illusory correlation. The idea of illusory correlation is that we tend to see patterns or correlations that don't exist. The brain, in some ways, is a pattern matching machine. Some psychologists have argued the very survival of the human species is dependent upon the brain's ability to predict the environment and the future and to see patterns so that we can act on those patterns for our survival. The psychologist Michael Shermer has actually done a lot of research on the nature of belief. And one of his fundamental ideas, one of his fundamental premises is what he calls patternicity, which is the same idea. As human beings, we've evolved to make sense of things that don't necessarily make sense, to make sense of the senseless. And we do that by finding order and patterns in the environment.
This reminds me of the patterns that I've heard Lori talk about. Lori loves patterns. It's like her perpetual way of seeing the world. Take a listen to her here.
So he told my husband and I to move to Kauai. So we're like, you really want us to move to Hawaii? Like, I'm going to need a confirmation of this on my father. Like, you're going to have to tell me this again. So I had 6 confirmations in the temple that we should move to Kauai. And the very last one was a lady. And I went into the dressing room and she said, oh, would you do a name for me? I grabbed her name, looked at the name, put it in my pocket. And I told my father, I was like, I know you've given me like 5 confirmations. I'll go do whatever you want me to do, but I really need to know this is what you want us to do. And so I'm in the Mesa Temple, and as soon as I'm going through the veil, look at this card. I open it up, look at her name, and it's stamped Hawaii, Hawaii, Hawaii. And it was, the date was the day before. So she was yesterday in the Laie Temple, and then she's flown overnight, and now she's in the Mesa Temple, handing me this card. Would you do a name for me? Hawaii, Hawaii, Hawaii. The Lord is in all the details of our lives.
Sometimes those patterns are accurate. A lot of times they're not. It's the same thing with illusory correlation. It's a similar idea. You have a family culture with Lori that has a great deal of chaos. The natural response to that is to find order in the random dots.
Okay. Right.
It's to see things that aren't there. It's to develop some type of pattern matching beliefs to make sense of the environment. I think that in this family, the one constant that Lori finds is this belief in her Mormon faith, which in and of itself isn't an issue. It becomes an issue for Lori because she's using these beliefs to solve all of her childhood problems. She's hiding behind these beliefs so that she doesn't have to deal with the uncertainty and the abuse and the pain and the inconsistencies in the environment.
Okay. You know, John and I were listening to the entire recording of Lori bearing her testimony in October 2018. And this soundbite here that we'll share with you, the moment Lori said this.
And Satan had been torturing me since I was a little kid. So I've had that my whole life.
That Satan has been torturing her since she was a little kid. John quickly said, what did you say?
When I heard that, my first thought was she's talking about her father. She's talking about Barry Cox. She can't refer to her dad as Satan, but I think she's referencing her dad. If her father was abusive, it's easier for her to call him Satan than to call him dad. It's easier for her to deal with that, to deal with the pain and the trauma of being abused by seeing this as a function of Satan rather than as coming from a family member. She's labeling Satan all of the abuse that occurred in the family. She's using the term Satan as a catch-all for the traumatic environment that you grew up in. But the biggest part of that traumatic environment was hypothetically her father. So directly or indirectly, she's referring to Barry, her father, as Satan. She could never say that directly. She would never point the finger at her father, even if abuse transpired and she wanted to, because it wouldn't be safe. Because there's a lot of loyalty in this family. We talked about this family being enmeshed, which means that they're overly close. They have poor boundaries. They protect each other at all costs. So it's easier for her to create this belief that it was Satan that caused this rather than her father.
Okay. So in other words, back to what you were saying.
So she's using religious concepts to try to create emotional distance from the pain and trauma of her childhood. She's using Satan for evil. She's using the term Jesus for
good.
For good, right. This is how this notion of love becomes associated with Jesus for Lori, and how that then becomes a panacea for all of her trauma and all the abuse. But it also becomes a way for her to suppress or push away any negative emotions.
Jesus, Satan, black or white, either or, it's always these two extremes. It's interesting because a couple months ago when this recording came out, the part of this recording that made the news was Lori saying that she wanted to murder Joe Ryan, her ex-husband, Tylee's father, that she essentially made the choice between either murdering Joe Ryan or going to the temple every day. Like that was her either or there. Here's that moment when she says she has to make this choice.
I was going to murder him. I was going to kill him, like the scriptures say, like Nephi killed it, just to stop the pain. So I went and met my bishop, and I was like, I'm either going to turn my life to the temple or I'm going to commit murder.
So, wow, there's a reason this recording made the news. She just admitted publicly her willingness to murder. What is going on here? We've all been waiting to see what you think of this.
I think there's two main components to Lori's statement there. The first is what I would refer to as the cognitive or problem-solving component. In other words, how she assesses the world intellectually and how she solves problems based upon that assessment.
As in, like, how could she think this is even normal to say? Or
no, that she's seen a problem, which is Joe Ryan, and the way she's trying to solve that intellectually is through murder.
Yeah.
So the first component is an intellectual one. It's what I would call a decision-making or problem-solving component. And the second component would be more of an emotional component, which is how she perceives Joe Ryan as a human being, or does she perceive Joe Ryan as a human being? Let's start with the first one. Let's look at the cognitive, intellectual component of this statement first. The problem is that Lori doesn't perceive any options here. There's a psychologist, a German psychologist by the name of Dietrich Dorner, who wrote a book called The Logic of Failure. It's a brilliant book. It's one of my favorite books. It's probably one of the most neglected books that I can think of in our field. But what Dorner says is that every system, and that includes families, that includes communities, that includes social problems like poverty, and any system that we deal with, there's a lot of complexity. We as human beings struggle with that. We struggle with two things. We struggle with solving problems that are complex, that have a lot of variables that are related to each other, and we struggle with predicting the future. That, in other words, it's not just that these problems are complex, but these problems have future consequences. And it's difficult for human beings in general to deal with complexity and to then project that complexity out into future consequences. So a great example of that would be something like climate change. Climate change is a very, very complex issue with a lot of variables that interact, that is very difficult and resistant to simple solutions. And the future consequences are that if something isn't done about this, then eventually Miami will be underwater, or there's going to be warming to an extent that many serious problems will result. My point is that Dorner says that when human beings are confronted with complex systems with many variables, one of the solutions to solving those types of problems is to resort to what he calls horizontal flight. Horizontal flight is we take a very small piece of the puzzle and we focus only on that. So let's say that someone is overwhelmed by climate change and they don't really know how to deal with the complexity of that. So in order to potentially cope with that problem, they'll gravitate towards one very specific, simple solution. For example, perhaps the solution might be throwing out their aluminum cans in a recycling bin every week. And that's all they do. And maybe that's going to help, but it's certainly not going to solve this problem at a larger level. It makes the person feel better. It makes them feel like they're contributing, but it's not going to solve the problem. It's taking a very small piece of the puzzle and using that piece as a way to cope with the anxiety and stress of this larger problem.
Or let's take the mindset of Lori Vallow. Climate change isn't even an issue because Jesus Christ is coming and the second coming is on its way and it doesn't even matter. That's her solution to the problem, I'm sure, and every problem.
Well, and that's the second issue that Dorner talks about, that when a problem becomes so overwhelming that we don't know how to cope with it, we resort to what he calls vertical flight, which is essentially just going into flights of fantasy. Fantasy will take you away from the problems completely. It'll take you into another world, a fictional world. And I think Lori actually does both here. So when she talks about murder as a solution, she's actually using both. She's using horizontal flight because she's trying to simplify this problem to such an extent that she's saying there's only one solution here. It's murder or the temple. There's nothing in between. Right. She's making this problem, which is fairly complex but solvable, into this really simple horizontal flight solution, which is let's murder this guy.
Right. And Alex Cox did attack him once. So we know there's definitely a thought process in the Cox household.
And vertical flight we see with precisely what Lauren just said, which is this flight into the fantasy of Jesus Christ is going to solve all our problems, and the second coming makes all these problems irrelevant. And so what if I murder this guy because the world's coming to an end anyway, so why worry about it? Who cares if he's dead? He's going to be dead anyway. It's just a matter of time, which, by the way, it appears that Lori, going back many, many years, we don't know exactly when, but probably into her childhood, Lori has harbored this fantasy of the second coming or the imminence of the new world, the rapture, the apocalypse. She's had this fantasy for many, many years. So Chad coming into her life with this vision of the apocalypse is nothing new. Lori's expected this for many years.
Right. This isn't a new belief. But can we talk about the second element here? You mentioned that it was emotional, because it's more than strange. I mean, it's psychotic that she, in my opinion, at least, that she would just want to murder this guy. Like, that's where her mind goes. Temple or murder. And she's telling her church leader this, I'm going to murder him. What is going through her mind?
Once you understand that the cognitive component is the most simplistic, reductive strategy possible. In other words, if you can't solve a problem with your ex, very few people are going to resort to the most simplistic solution of murder. But once you do that, then that brings you to the second component, which is an utter lack of empathy, an utter lack of compassion, empathy, and understanding for another human being. In other words, what she's doing here is completely objectifying Joe Ryan. Keep in mind that Joe Ryan is the father of her daughter.
Right.
No matter how bad this is, and I understand Lori sees this as a major barrier to her child's well-being because she believes that Tylee was sexually abused.
Maybe. Or she's making the whole thing up.
Right, in spite of the fact that there's no evidence showing that Tylee was sexually abused. But the fact is that she sees Joe as an object that's in her way and that should be disposed of through murder rather than as a thinking, feeling, potentially loving human being that deserves respect and that should have some presence in her daughter's life.
In all of the court documents that I have read, and I have read hundreds of pages now of court documents, I have not seen any proof that Tylee was ever sexually abused by Joe Ryan. I will share that.
This lack of emotion is consistent with a good deal of research on psychopaths. I have speculated previously that Lori seems to lack fear, which is supported by the research by Abigail Marsh. But we can take this a step further here and examine some of the research on psychopathy more broadly, which indicates that psychopaths lack emotion more generally, specifically what are called the distress emotions. The distress emotions are fear and sadness. And the reason that's important is because when people experience fear or sadness, a typical human response is to reach out to that person and to nurture them, to help them. A psychopath lacking the ability to understand and to react to the stress emotions lacks the ability to comfort and connect to other human beings. So in other words, without the ability to experience or recognize distress emotions, there's a disconnection from other people. There's a lack of empathy. There's a tendency to objectify people, just as she's doing with Joe Ryan in this quote. This is a quote by Sheldon Itzkowitz from a book called Psychopathy and Human Evil. This is on page 21. He is summarizing some of the research on psychopaths. Here's what he says. Quote, they, meaning psychopaths, are emotionally shallow and superficial people who lack the basic personal qualities and emotions necessary to create and maintain deep, loving, intimate relationships. They want and crave excitement and novelty, without which they become bored easily. Psychopaths' dangerousness is disguised by their capacity for presenting themselves as charming, likable, amusing, entertaining, quick-witted, and interesting people.
Sounds like Lori.
If we look at this in terms of Lori, I think it's not hard to see that her lack of empathy, her immediate impulse to go towards murder rather than empathy is so obvious and evident in this testimony of hers that it's actually a bit frightening. Let's go back to the Cox family and talk about belief. I want to reference some of the work of Kathleen Taylor, who's a psychologist who teaches at Oxford. She wrote a book called Brainwashing. And Kathleen Taylor has argued that, along with many psychologists, that emotionally charged beliefs are by far the most difficult to change. That the amygdala, which we've talked about with Lori, often becomes activated by strong emotions, a fight or flight type response. And when the amygdala and the hypothalamus and various parts of the midbrain are activated, they form memories that are emotionally charged. And these memories, when they become associated with beliefs, become really, really resistant to change. Social psychologists typically refer to this as hot cognition. This is important because I think that Lori, growing up, was very much in this condition of not only uncertainty, like we mentioned, and trauma because of some of the abuse, but it was an emotionally charged atmosphere. This was a family that was going from tyrannical control to complete chaos a lot, I think, because of Barry's inconsistencies. So what this means is that the emotional nature of that family culture means that these beliefs in the Mormon church and in the second coming and in the rapture become very entrenched. They become very resistant to change. They're extremely emotionally charged. However, there's an irony here, which is the beliefs in religion have a lot of emotion behind them, but the kids and the family don't. This is not a family that's good with emotions. In fact, they're emotionally deficient.
There's a lot of emotion connected with these beliefs, but there's deficiencies in actually expressing the emotions.
Right. In fact, Alex Cox, Lori Vallow's brother, I spoke to his friend, Mary Tracy, for an hour, and she really did say they never talked about really any emotions. He would absolutely not talk about emotions. That full interview is on our Patreon account for our Patreon members.
Right. This was a family that couldn't deal with emotions. In fact, they were emotionally deficient. And not only that, Stacy, with her anorexia and with her type 1 diabetes, that was never discussed.
Didn't they go to Hawaii when she was dying?
Yeah, that's what the family therapist Murray Bowen is called emotional cutoff, which is when there's a highly emotionally charged situation, you run away from it. You literally go to Hawaii or Disneyland. You escape to somewhere that's safer, that feels safer, that doesn't have the emotional charge.
And we have learned that, am I right? That that's what the Cox family does, and what I would say the Lori Vallow family did, that they would escape by going someplace.
In episode 9, we talked about how Barry, in his defense of Stacy, in Stacy's custody battle with Steve Cope, how Barry said quite emphatically that he didn't understand how Steve could be disgruntled because they took trips to Disneyland and Hawaii, and he spent all this money on him.
To clarify, Barry Cox, Lori's father, the custody battle with Steve Cope, the late Stacy's ex-husband, as they were getting divorced. So Barry's daughter, Stacy, and Steve Cope.
Barry, in his custody affidavit, sees money and trips and material goods as an expression of love.
Right, not love itself.
Right. And this actually is going to be a really important idea. And also, I should add that Colby said something very similar when I talked to him. Colby said that it was very common that when the emotional temperature in the family was turned up, that the response from Lori was exactly the same. It was to flee the situation and to go have fun. So in other words, the solution was to bury any emotion or any emotional issues and to run to Disneyland or Hawaii or kind of these typical, apparently they had these
Places.
prominent gathering places that they seem to always go to.
So in other words, there is no emotion in the Cox family or in Lori Vallow Daybell.
And one thing we've heard over and over from friends and people close to Lori is she simply did not express or show emotion, with the exception of anger. And even then, it wasn't super common, but anger and some joy. But we never heard anyone describe Lori as ever being fearful or sad. In other words, it's consistent with the lack of understanding and expression of the distress emotions. Many of these ideas on distress emotions, by the way, can be found in the research of James Blair and some of his colleagues. Blair summarizes a lot of his early research in a book called The Psychopath, Emotion and the Brain from 2005.
And one thing you said that I loved was she was a drama queen without the emotion.
She's like a stone cold, emotionless drama queen.
Sounds fun. But then in this testimony, her voice would change. I heard her in a new light that I'd never seen her. It wasn't the high-pitched Lori talking to Chad in prison. It was a loud, authoritative Lori. Were those not emotions then that I was hearing? Listen to this. There seems to be drama.
And I got to see myself as a warrior fighting for the savior in the pre-mortal world. And I went to other worlds and I fought. And I was one of his strongest warriors. And I saw it. And he showed me so that I could never deny it again. I was not sweet and I was not innocent. I am old. I have fought in this war for millennia. And that's who I am. And I came down here to be a warrior and fight.
There's a difference between drama and emotion. You can imagine someone acting or an actor expressing emotion that they may not feel. Actually, if you listen closely to the Lori testimony, there's very little emotion. If you listen really, really closely, she talks about murder almost in a deadpan voice.
So I went and met my bishop and I was like, I'm either going to turn my life to the temple or I'm going to commit murder. So do you want to give me a temple recommend? And I was perfectly honest because at that point I had nothing to lose. You get to the bottom rung and I had nothing to lose. And he gave me my temple recommend.
She talks about sobbing all night.
I would just be in there just sobbing. I would just be in there in the celestial room sobbing. And people would come up to me all the time and be like, sister, are you okay? And I'd be like, no, I'm not okay. And I'd just keep crying.
She talks about all of these emotional issues, but she does it in a very dramatic, unemotional way. It feels like she's acting. I don't think Lori was connected to her emotions, just as the Cox family wasn't connected to their emotions, with the exception of anger and rage. And that's common in these borderline type families that Beavers describes.
She mentions emotion in her testimony. Here are a couple places.
You made me this super sweet person. I'm so sensitive. My whole life, everything hurt my feelings. I was totally sweet and innocent. And I was like, why would you ask me to fight this life and be this warrior?
She says that she would be sobbing in the temple, that she was having her own pain.
I felt like someone was just stabbing me in the stomach with a knife all the time. I felt physical pain. I felt so much physical pain and emotional pain and mental pain. And in the meantime, I was dealing with a husband and 2 stepkids and my 2 kids, and then waking up screaming in the middle of the night and night sweats and terrors and all the things that go along with everything that happens with that.
Satan's been torturing her. We talked about that.
Interestingly enough, Lori's last statement about the night terrors sounds a lot like post-traumatic stress disorder, which would be consistent with some of her possible childhood traumas.
When she talks about emotions,
she's describing emotions without emotion. These ideas actually remind me of a dialogue from the Showtime series Dexter.
I was actually thinking the same thing. John and I watch Dexter together.
Yeah, it makes for great date nights.
For a psychologist and a journalist, it does.
Dexter is actually a character and a fictional character, but so much of this show is consistent with psychopathy. It raises a lot of questions about crime and evil. The quote we're going to play, it's a dialogue between Dexter and Lila, and Dexter is confronting Lila, and Lila, by the way, has many features of borderline personality disorder.
We were watching it, and I actually said to John, She reminds me of Lori.
Here's that dialogue from Dexter.
This is from season 2, episode 12.
What do you think I wanted?
To know what it's like. Feel something that deeply. Anything. That's why you hang out in recovery groups. You're emotionally colorblind. You use the right words, you pantomime the right behavior. The feelings never come to pass.
It's not true.
It is, Lila. You know the dictionary definition of emotions. Longing, joy, sorrow. But you have no idea what any of those things actually feel like.
You're wrong. I have feelings for you.
You want to have feelings for me. They're just impulses.
Enough.
They're primitive responses to immediate needs. You know all the words, but you can't hear the music.
Lila.
I'm just like you.
This is one of the paradoxes of Lori Vallow-Dabow, that she can appear to be emotional, but she's not actually feeling. She's hiding behind all of this rhetoric about religion without actually feeling. It's almost like she knows what to say and she tries to express this emotional side, but she can't do it.
Well, that's definitely true. We hear her all the time saying things and acting and lying and manipulating. I mean, is that the manipulative part of who she is? She's so manipulative.
Well, the line is a great example. A good liar is best without emotion. In fact, here's a little tidbit that psychopaths are really good at passing lie detectors because they don't feel. They don't have any emotion. If you think about a character like Dexter, and I know that's fictional, but Dexter, who's a serial killer, one of the things he says all the time in that series is, I have no feelings. So the way Dexter is able to function, and I think he's based upon actual serial killers, by the way, his character, the way he's able to function in that series is fascinating. He functions through deceit. He's able to have normal relationships and to express some emotions or pretend like he's expressing emotions, but there's nothing there. He's quite honest about the fact that he doesn't know how to feel. And I think you see something similar with Lori. Again, psychopaths are masterful at passing lie detectors because lie detectors are based upon the premise that we can get a baseline of emotion or anxiety. They're trying to get galvanic skin responses that are picking up on those subtle emotional cues in the body that get expressed through on the lie detector in subtle ways. But psychopaths can essentially blunt all anxiety and all emotion and go flatline on a lie detector, which means that when you ask a question that's emotionally charged, they're not going to respond to it.
That makes a lot of sense because she does lie so effortlessly. Here are some of Lori's lies. I collected a lot of these. We're going to start with Melanie Gibbs' testimony at Chad Daybell's preliminary hearing. Melanie is Lori's best friend. Melanie says that Lori told her that Lori gave JJ to Kay Woodcock, JJ's biological grandmother, by convincing Kay that Lori had cancer.
I asked how it went, giving JJ to Kay. She told me that they met up in an airport and she told Kay that she had breast cancer and that she would need help with JJ for a period of time. And she said it went well.
Now let's head to the first initial welfare check police made on JJ. The request was made by Kay, that same Kay who is JJ's grandmother. And by the time this welfare check happens, Lori is married to Chad. Both of their spouses are dead, and both JJ and Tylee have been murdered. And now, according to Lori, Kay is trying to kidnap JJ.
He was just saying that he wanted to do a well check on JJ.
So JJ would be where?
He's in Arizona.
Who's he with in Arizona?
He's with one of my friends in Arizona.
Oh.
One of my brothers is trying to kill me, not the brother that lives here, obviously. He's kind of my protector. My other brother that was in with my husband who was trying to kill me for my $2 million life insurance policy.
No.
Since he passed away, she's been trying to fight me for him and being really horrible to me and that kind of stuff. So I knew she was going to try to sue me for him or, yeah, because she now has this $1 million, so she can hire people to help him, and I have nothing.
But you have
nothing.
legal custody.
He's my son. I adopted him.
Right.
So she does nothing who wants to cause me trouble. We moved up here in September. My daughter to go to BYUI.
Your daughter goes to BYUI?
Yeah.
Does she live here?
Mm-hmm.
You listen to Lori lie again and again and again, and I never sense any guilt, any anxiety. I mean, maybe there's almost a bit of joy in manipulation. Maybe that's the only thing that I can see. But you're right. There's no worry.
Right. And normal human beings, when they lie, usually it's hard. It's harder for normal human beings to lie because there's some feeling associated with the lie, that it's hard to disguise our feelings completely. And I think when I sit in front of someone in a prison, for example, I'm always looking at those subtle cues. Does the person show any emotion? Is there any emotion or feeling associated with a lie? And if there's not, and I know for the most part it's a lie because 10 witnesses have said that they saw this behavior, they saw this crime, then that concerns me. Then I'm thinking this is someone that could very well be a psychopath because there's an absolute lack of emotion.
And that takes us back to that experience where Melanie Gibb, Lori Vallow's best friend, testified in court that when Lori called Melanie to lie about JJ's whereabouts, she was not nervous at all.
When I picked up, she said, just want to let you know everything's fine. She was upbeat, cheery, acting like nothing was wrong.
She had no emotion. When Chad Daybell called Melanie and told her the same thing, please lie about where JJ is, he was nervous. That's what she said. He was nervous.
I asked him if he was nervous, and he said yes.
To your perception, when you spoke with Mr. Daybell that day, how did he sound?
Very nervous.
Is that why you asked him if he was nervous?
Uh-huh.
So Lori essentially one-ups Chad. She's a psychopath.
We've talked about the fact that she expresses no fear,
right,
and that she can't recognize fear. We can probably carry that a step further and say that with the exception of anger, she expresses no emotions. Dexter in the HBO series says he has no emotions whatsoever of any kind, even anger. But Lori, like a good psychopath, has some anger, and I think she gets that from her family, and also the anger is consistent with borderline personality disorder. I want to just circle back to Kathleen Taylor's research on brainwashing. Taylor talks about the conditions under which beliefs can change. The basic premise with a belief is it forms in our family, that if it's emotionally charged, it's very difficult to change. But Taylor says that if there's high uncertainty, and we go back to that a lot, like this notion of uncertainty is fundamental to the way beliefs get formed. The greater the uncertainty, the more likely we are to search for structure and order to make sense of our environment, especially in childhood. If you're in a traumatic environment, the best way, or one of the best ways to cope with that, is to try to impose some type of order or pattern on that environment. And in this case, with Lori, that happens to be through religion. But Taylor says that the way you can change a belief is create maximum uncertainty, and then to have an emotionally charged environment. So again, both of these are true of the Cox family. And here's the most important piece: to engage in the repetition of whatever belief it is you want to be formed or changed. So again, if you think about the Cox family, there's constant repetition of these extreme religious beliefs that Lori is hearing over and over again. So you have not only the conditions where these beliefs are going to be formed and hardened and very difficult to overcome, but these turn out to be the same conditions that allow us to change beliefs. So if you wanted to deprogram someone from a cult, this is precisely what you'd have to do. You'd create other conditions of uncertainty, which would be really uncomfortable someone, but you'd try to do that. And you would want to throw in a certain amount of stress. And then you would want to engage in repetition of whatever new belief you're trying to instill, which, by the way, as an aside, as long as we're talking about beliefs, I want to reinforce some of these ideas with a quote from Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner, psychologist who teaches at my alma mater, Princeton. He won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2002 for his research on behavioral economics. This is a quote from Kahneman. He says, quote, "For some of our most important beliefs, we have no evidence at all, except that people we love and trust hold these beliefs. Considering how little we know, the confidence we have in our beliefs is preposterous, and it is also essential." Kahneman is essentially saying exactly what we're talking about here, which is beliefs don't necessarily need to be based upon evidence, that they're emotional, that they start in our families, and that once we have these beliefs, once they're formed, we then engage in seeking information that confirms our beliefs. We've talked about this earlier.
Confirmation bias.
Right. This is the confirmation bias. This is such a huge bias for all of us, that we seek information to confirm our beliefs.
Which is very easy with Google these days. You can find anything you want.
But we don't seek information that disconfirms our beliefs. And so this is why beliefs become entrenched. We grow up in a family culture that's emotionally charged or uncertain or has a certain amount of chaos, and we gravitate towards certain beliefs. Our family repeats. Our family provides us with a lot of repetition of certain beliefs, and those beliefs become entrenched. And then we go out into the world and we look for confirmation of those beliefs to show us their validity. The other thing that happens as we get older and move away from our families is that we maintain beliefs to maintain our self-concepts. There's this theory called self-verification theory in psychology that essentially predicts that most human beings, in order to remain consistent with how we perceive ourselves, we will act in habitual ways and believe things in an habitual way so that it confirms that we are who we think we are. In addition to attempting to verify our perceptions of ourselves, we also seek others, social groups, social networks who share similar beliefs and ideas, because that too reinforces our identity. It normalizes our beliefs, no matter how extreme they are.
Sort of like Lori sharing her, what I would call extreme testimony at Melanie Gibbs' home, or this group attending their Preparing the People conferences. Their extreme beliefs stop feeling so extreme, surrounded by people accepting and confirming these beliefs.
A really critical component of a cult, for example, is the fact that you're associating with like-minded individuals, and those people are reinforcing all of your beliefs, even if they're completely untethered from reality. That very rarely are you going to find people to challenge those beliefs. Again, this is the confirmation bias, right? That this is true of how we see ourselves and our identities, and it's also true of the people that we seek out and the social groups that we join.
Lori's family definitely plays a part in her beliefs. Clearly, the family religion, but even more so, we have heard from a reliable source that her family was also attending these Preparing the People meetings, and that they were possibly there at a meeting shortly after Lori met Chad, if not at another meeting. That was a shared belief in the extremism. But also, going back to confirmation bias, can we talk about Spencer again? Over an hour ago, we started this podcast with Spencer, a man convinced that he was in a virtual relationship with Katy Perry. Despite never meeting the pop star, he finds evidence or confirmation bias of this extreme belief in email messages, in Katy Perry's own song lyrics. Spencer knows without a doubt that Katy Perry's in love with him.
Yeah, I think the Kahneman quote is entirely consistent with Spencer's belief that Katy Perry's in love with him.
I mean, they give him so much evidence on this episode. John and I have now watched this episode 3 times, by the way. We'll say to each other sometimes, we'll check ourselves. Are you dating Katy Perry right now? Because the hosts of this MTV show give him evidence after evidence that shows him you are absolutely being catfished. You are not dating Katy Perry. Katy Perry doesn't know who you are. Here's a girl named Harriet who's actually catfishing you. And he'll say, yeah, no, I know it's her. I know things that you don't know. And again, her song lyrics are speaking to me and there's hints in them. You guys just don't know. It's amazing to watch. Listen to Spencer here while he is meeting Harriet, the woman who has been writing him for 6 years, pretending to be Katy Perry.
Where did we meet again?
On the app.
Oh,
Yeah.
dude. No,
It's her.
I don't think it is, man.
Well, who else could it be?
I mean, really, Katie.
You can't possibly think it's still Katy Perry.
I do.
Okay, so
Whoa.
do you want to? I mean, can you just pop his bubble for a second and tell him that he has not been talking to Katy Perry?
Is there something you can tell him that might ring true?
Your middle name's Ray. You dressed up as that hot sauce for Halloween.
What's the name of our kids that we talked about?
It was Laika, Luca, something else. Start with L, probably.
It's not her.
What do you mean?
It's not her.
Why did she get the names
not
wrong?
No, she got the two names right.
Dude. She doesn't remember
Oh, it was
things as much as you do.
Dude, I'm sorry,
Dude, this
man.
is not.
If you remember
You're not
every-
getting punked
It
right
was
now.
Boss.
There's
It
no.
was
This is
Boss.
it.
I think that Katie would get a kick out of me getting punked a little bit. This might be a little bit part
So
of
Katy
that.
Perry and Harriet conspired to bring you here.
I got some details that were pretty important. So
She doesn't
weren't
care.
important details to her.
Right, because she didn't care that much, which is maybe harder to accept.
We found the person you've been talking to beyond really any shred of doubt. And you still want to believe the thing that makes you happier.
And I think that takes us back to this idea of love that we started with. The question is, why does Spencer cling so tightly to this idea that Katy Perry loves him? And I think the reason is because it's emotionally charged for him. In the episode, he's actually really flat. He doesn't have many emotions at all. Much as I would imagine Lori doesn't have many emotions. Lori's more dramatic, but I don't think Lori has a lot of those underlying emotions.
As you would say, when we watch, he's flat. He has no affect.
And so what Spencer wants is he wants to feel normal. He wants to feel connected. He wants an experience of being alive and feeling loved and feeling like he belongs. And I think those are exactly the same things that Lori wants. They are both seeking some way of resolving all past childhood hurts and wounds, and possibly even seeking redemption through love. The commonality, to dig a little deeper than we did at the beginning of this episode, the commonality here is that love for these two is an abstraction.
What do you mean in abstraction? Love is an abstraction.
I mean, thinking about love as an ideal state. In other words, it's the type of love you might find in a Disney movie like Cinderella, or maybe in the Twilight series, where a vampire and a human being fall in love, and love is idealized in a very romantic, unrealistic way. In fact, love is seen as immortal. So the notion of love as an abstraction is seeing love as perfection, as bliss, as a love that's largely unobtainable and likely not of this world. Lori says in that opening quote that Jesus's love is not of this world.
After I've had this washing over of the Lord, who gave me all of his complete love, all of his peace, which is not of this world.
It's similar with the Katy Perry analogy with Spencer. He doesn't know Katy Perry, and he never will. That it's an abstraction to him, that this love is a fantasy that he's creating, right? It's not a real love.
It's out of this world.
It's out of this world, right? It's not a world he would know or will ever know. But what it does for him is it allows him to experience some sense of belonging and connection and love, at least when he's fantasizing about being with Katy Perry. And I think Lori, when she's fantasizing about being with Jesus Christ, is going through a very similar experience. Both want to feel special and connected to something potentially larger than life. Both maintain an ideal of perfect love as an attempt to fill an emotional void. For both of them, I think to some degree, this is about some type of redemption, some type of cleansing of past sins or wounds or hurts from childhood. Listen to Spencer here, talking as if Katy Perry is Christ-like.
And we are all bearing witness to it coming to fruition. It's Katy. I know it's Katy. And we are all bearing witness to it coming to fruition.
Huh. So take your pick, Jesus or Katy.
Well, I would imagine that no matter who we are, Katy Perry is probably more obtainable than Jesus Christ. I mean, at least she exists in this world. I mean, if I had to, I could probably get Katy Perry's autograph, but I'm pretty sure I couldn't get Jesus's autograph.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah. I wonder if Spencer could ever get Katy Perry's autograph. He deserves Katy Perry's autograph. I'll say that.
In fairness, Katy Perry does know about Spencer and she feels empathy for him. So I don't think it's out of the question to think that he might get her autograph one day.
True. We hope you do, Spencer. So help me understand. Let's see, what's my question? I guess help me understand why this all matters.
I think seeing love as an abstraction is problematic because it tends to demean life. What happens is we cling to impossible dreams in exchange for living life as it is. We become so consumed by our fantasies of love that we start reaching for unobtainable ideals. We become captivated by the unachievable, by the rapture, by a world that doesn't exist. And that takes us away from our lives. That takes us away from life and real love that's painfully finite and imperfect and complex. And I think that's problematic because in the case of Spencer, for example, he's so consumed by this fantasy of being with Katy Perry that he probably fails to function in his everyday life. And it certainly takes him away from finding real love with a person that might be able to truly love him. And with Lori, it similarly takes her away from finding any type of meaningful flesh and blood love with a partner who could potentially offer her a reciprocal relationship. So why does this matter? Because I think it's important, if we're searching for love in particular, to look at what's obvious, to find love that's potentially in front of us, and ultimately to be able to cope with life and love and all its complexity, richness, and messiness, because that's real. I think as difficult as it may be, that's what gives us some type of fulfillment and makes our lives meaningful and authentic.
This reminds me of a quote that John and I both love about Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was a well-known astronomer. He hosted the well-known PBS documentary Cosmos, which he actually co-wrote with his wife, Anne Drian.
My recollection of Carl Sagan was his famous use of the expression often parodied on Saturday Night Live by saying billions and billions and billions of light years away.
And many do know this about Carl Sagan. He was a non-believer. His wife, Andrienne, a Peabody Award-winning writer who also co-wrote, again, Cosmos with him, wrote a tribute for her husband. She wrote this, sharing the depth of their love and what it meant for them. She says, "When my husband died, because he was so famous and known for not being a believer, many people would come up to me. It still sometimes happens, and ask me if Carl changed at the end and converted to a belief in an afterlife. They also frequently ask me if I think I will ever see him again. Carl faced death with unflagging courage and never sought refuge in illusions. The tragedy was that we knew we would never see each other again. I don't ever expect to be reunited with Carl. But the great thing is that when we were together for nearly 20 years, we lived with a vivid appreciation of how brief and precious life is. We never trivialized the meaning of death by pretending it was anything other than a final parting. Every single moment that we were alive and we were together was miraculous. Not miraculous in the sense of inexplicable or supernatural. We knew we were beneficiaries of chance, that pure chance could be so generous and so kind, that we could find each other, as Carl wrote so beautifully in Cosmos, in the vastness of space and the immensity of time, that we could be together for 20 years. That is something which sustains me, and it's much more meaningful. The way he treated me and the way I treated him, the way we took care of each other and our family while he lived, that is so much more important than the idea I will see him someday. I don't think I'll ever see Carl again, but I saw him. We saw each other. We found each other in the cosmos, and that was wonderful."
Thank you for sharing that.
Unlike Andrienne, I do hope that I'll be able to see my husband again one day. I cling to that hope and that faith. But whether or not that hope comes to fruition that I have to be with him, what matters is why we're together now. Whether we know and believe and have faith in the afterlife with our loved ones or not, what matters is that we love them now. That, I do believe, is more important than the belief or the hope that I might see him again someday.
This quote means a lot to me because it's precisely the opposite of Lori and Chad's relationship.
Exactly. The opposite.
Where they see love as an illusion, they see love as something to be found in the future, something to be had in the New Jerusalem, but much less important in the here and now. I think the big question I always have is, can you see the person in front of you? Can you really see them? This is what Anne brings up. Can you see them for who they really are? And can they show you who they are? And in spite of that, can you still love them with a fierce appreciation and respect? I think very clearly Chad and Lori failed immensely in that arena, and their illusion of this ideal love in this other world led them in the wrong direction, and it led them to a disastrous outcome, which I hope by seeing each other we can avoid.
Like many of our episodes, this one will be split into two parts. We have a whole other hour of dinner coming for our next episode. We are happy to be back and producing episodes, and we're so grateful for those who have stayed with us during this lapse. We are new to the podcasting world, and like I said earlier, we've had to dot some I's and cross some T's, and we are planning to continue for a long time. To remind everyone, we have started a YouTube channel, Hidden True Crime. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/hidden true crime, and our Instagram is instagram.com/hidden true crime. We want to thank Cheryl Wheeler She's the ex-wife of Charles Vallow, who was shot and killed. She knew Lori, and she has provided us so much insight, information, and documents that we have never seen before. Cheryl, we're so grateful for your time. We will be discussing many of these things in the coming episodes. A quick PSA. There is a Facebook discussion group that many of our listeners were a part of. True Crime Underground, Lori Vallow Cult Mom is the name. That group was taken down a month or two ago. Don't know why. Ask Facebook. But that group is back up. John and I do not run this group, but the administrators of that group want you to know that you are not deleted or kicked off of that group and would love for you to join again. That Facebook group is called, again, True Crime Underground, Lori Vallow Cult Mom. But be warned, the rabbit hole of information on this case never ends. Thank you for our supporters who help make our podcast possible at patreon.com/hidden true crime. We also want to thank the women with Wicked Truths and F-Bombs. They have given us a lot of the documents that we've been able to go through. Thank you for joining us for dinner tonight. We hope that you'll continue to share with your friends that there is a seat for them at our dinner table as well.
And as usual,
stay out of portals.
Wear a helmet.
And we'll add to that, don't date Katy Perry.
She's taken.
And even if she wasn't,
don't date Katy Perry.
Don't date Katy Perry.
It will probably lead to nothing positive.
Stay safe and wear a helmet. Don't go into portals.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Hidden, a true crime podcast. A forensic psychologist and a journalist explore the hidden motives behind unthinkable crimes while examining our deepest fears along the way.
Is that American 11 trying to call?
Buddy, we have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We're turning to the airport.
And who's trying to call me here? American 11, are you trying to call?
Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any move, you'll injure yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet.
This is Lauren Matthias.
And I'm Dr. John Matthias. That chilling audio is Muhammad Atta. Muhammad Atta is the terrorist who flew Flight 11 into the North Tower of the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. Muhammad Atta was a part of Al-Qaeda and largely responsible for the plan and execution to bring down the World Trade Centers. You might be wondering why we're going to lead with Muhammad Atta today.
We still need to talk about Spencer, right? Weren't we talking about Spencer in the last episode, part 1? Who's dating or thought he was dating Katy Perry?
Okay, I've been talking to this woman for the last 6 years. I'm in love with her. Wow. She's awesome. It's Katy Perry.
Yes, we were, but we really need to up the ante this week, and we need to move from the idea of love as a panacea to love as something potentially lethal. So in other words, Spencer is important in helping us understand how a normal person can view love through a very distorted lens and become wrapped up in an abstraction or an ideal of love or anything for that matter that then takes over one's life and leads to potentially inexplicable behaviors, and not only that, is willing to pursue that ideal without any evidence.
For those who didn't listen to part 1, which if you haven't listened to episode 13, the last episode, we recommend you do that first. But if you're going to continue, Spencer, I'm referring to Spencer, who's in love with Katy Perry. We're talking about an episode of the MTV show Catfish. Spencer from Knoxville, Tennessee, believed that he was dating Katy Perry. Take a listen.
All right, Spencer, level with us for a second. On the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being I fully believe I'm in a virtual relationship with Katy Perry, and 1 being this could be true, but probably isn't, but I thought it would be a good episode of Catfish. Where do you fall on that scale? Like 1,000.
When we think about Spencer and Lori from last week, the analogy of chasing this ideal love for Spencer, that was falling in love with Katy Perry.
Katie's full of life. She's huge heart. Have you guys said that you love each other? Many times.
For Lori, that was reuniting with Jesus Christ in the afterlife.
I had the love of Jesus Christ who washed over me. There is nothing like that on this earth. It is life-changing and eternity-altering.
I should mention, by the way, that the reason Lori's belief about Jesus is so extreme is not because she sees Jesus as a loving figure with whom she develops a close relationship. Rather, the belief is extreme because Lori claims to have actually met and developed a relationship with Jesus in person, in the flesh.
I'll just start by saying that I am a personal witness of the resurrected Jesus Christ. I am his advocate and I am his friend.
That Jesus was a witness at her and Chad's marriage in the temple, and that additionally, she had encountered Jesus in the flesh.
We don't know much about her encounters with Jesus, just that she claims to have had them and will not deny them. Listen to this phone call with Melanie Gibb when she's expressing how strongly she feels about her relationship with Jesus Christ.
No, God knows it, and I will never deny it. For my soul would be at stake if I did. So you can say it didn't happen to me, Mel, but if I say it, then I am accountable. You didn't witness it, but I did. But you're.
So today, we want to transition from the idea of pursuing love as an ideal, which Lori and Spencer both do to some degree, and they do that to feel special, and because there's something redemptive about chasing love as an ideal. There's something that is potentially cleansing and healing about finding this love that is, in some ways, as we talked about last week, unrealistic and unobtainable. And I think in both cases, the notion that Spencer is in love with someone based on very flimsy evidence and that she's in love with him is, to him at least, redemptive and unique, and it makes him feel loved and special.
I have made a ring for her.
For Lori, similarly, the idea that she has met Jesus Christ in person and developed a personal relationship with him, and I'm not talking about that in the spiritual way that most Christians would describe.
No.
Right?
No.
I'm talking about a very different type of belief here. I'm talking about a belief of actually meeting Jesus Christ and not having more of a spiritual relationship or anticipating a spiritual relationship later.
Yeah, we're talking about a Mary Magdalene type of meeting. Or, for those who understand Mormonism, a Joseph Smith type of meeting, where Joseph Smith saw Jesus Christ, a resurrected being, in a grove of trees in the 1800s.
That was the foundation of Mormonism.
Yes, it was.
And so in some ways, that's what Lori's arguing here, is that her encounters with Jesus in the flesh are potentially foundational, and Chad too.
I think desiring to be like Joseph Smith, a prophet who, again, Believers say that Joseph Smith saw the resurrected Savior. I think this is a big part of Lori and Chad's fantasy. I want to play that recording with Melanie Gibb and Lori again. Chad's on the phone too during this part I'm about to play, but he's silent. It's confusing what's being discussed for those not familiar with Mormonism or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but if you listen closely, there's an argument or disagreement going on here. Melanie is arguing that Lori could not have seen or received what Lori believes she received because there were no other witnesses. Lori's rebuttal to Melanie is that the prophet Joseph Smith saw Jesus Christ when Joseph Smith was alone, so it doesn't matter if there was a witness. Thus, Lori knows what she saw is true. It's kind of disturbing when you realize the context. Lori is literally comparing herself to the revered founder of the LDS Church. To me, that implies that Lori really believes she's been called of God, just like Joseph Smith. Take a listen.
There's no witness that you ever received what you think you received. Nobody has seen that but you. There's no witness. The witness, Joseph Smith, all of the cavalry, Martin Harris, the 8 witnesses, they all showed up.
Is there a witness when Jesus, Heavenly Father, gave that to Joseph Smith by himself in the grove? Was there a witness?
No, but they had it later with other people. That was one experience, but others joined in later. When he brought other people into it, they had experiences.
Scriptures, yes or no?
I'm sorry?
Is that in the scriptures, yes or no?
That Joseph was alone when he saw God the Father and Jesus Christ?
Yes.
Yes, he was alone.
He was alone.
But he had to open it up first.
That's not a pattern at all.
Honey, what I'm saying is that after he saw that and other people joined in, they saw the things with him. He wasn't alone. There was a witness for them. There was no witness. Anybody's never seen what you've seen or experienced what you've seen. That's your own witness, but nobody said that.
No, God knows it, and I will never deny it. For my soul would be at stake if I did. So you can say it didn't happen to me, Mel, but if I say it, then I am accountable. You didn't witness it. But I did.
But your behaviors is not, okay, I understand that's what you believe you saw, but this is the thing, as I see, is that your behavior is not one of somebody that's in Christ. Your behavior. What?
I believe that Chad very much mirrored Joseph Smith's experiences from everything that I've read and can see. A lot of it is taken straight from Mormon history, Joseph Smith's life experiences.
And so I think that's a good transition to Muhammad Atta, which is moving us from this notion of love as an unobtainable ideal to love as a potentially lethal force.
American 11, are you trying to call?
Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any move, you'll injure yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet.
Muhammad Atta, who, oddly enough, is willing to murder thousands of people in the World Trade Centers in order to reunite with Allah or God, that he's doing this because he wants to attain some blissful state in the afterlife.
Sounds familiar.
And Lori's extreme beliefs in love and the apocalypse certainly begin to exceed in magnitude and extremity the beliefs that Spencer would ever hold. That Spencer, for the most part, is fairly benign, but I think he was a really good introduction and example of how beliefs can get formed in a very extreme manner without evidence, and they're simply false, they're fiction. And so Lori and Spencer share those commonalities in terms of seeing love as this unobtainable ideal and seeing love as something that's redemptive and feeling quite special as a result of those beliefs.
So in this episode then, since we're continuing about Lori, are we going to learn about how Lori and Muhammad Atta are similar?
Exactly. We want to leave Spencer behind. Sorry, Spencer.
He's going to show up a few times in this episode.
Yeah, he'll make an appearance.
We know that because this was recorded, as we said, at that same dinner table as part 1, but new introduction, new things to cover.
Right. We want to transition from love as this relatively harmless
ideal to the notion that love in some instances can be lethal. And I think the parallels between Muhammad Atta and Lori are quite striking. That what we want to do here is continue with this idea of love, but in a slightly different vein, and it's from a slightly different perspective, and one that gets us closer to understanding the mind of Lori Daybell and the mind of Muhammad Atta. And we will be looking at some research based on the mind of a terrorist that actually tends to bring these two, Atta and Lori, together in some fashion. Before we begin, I need to make another quick disclaimer. Please keep in mind that the defendants in this case, Chad and Lori, are both innocent until proven guilty. They still need to go to trial and they will have their day in court. Additionally, I want to remind our listeners, our analyses are speculative. We're developing hypothetical scenarios, much like a forensic psychologist might do. That does not mean that our interpretation of this situation is definitive. It just means that we're providing one analysis of this case. As many of you are aware, I'm sure many of our listeners have chimed in with alternative accounts of this case. So this is speculative. It's based on incomplete information, and it is meant to be educational and to spur dialogue about this case. All diagnoses discussed and provided are provisional. Those two are speculative. They're not definitive. Diagnosis is simply a part of the language of forensic psychology, so it would be unavoidable for me not to discuss some diagnoses because it's part of the vocabulary that forensic psychologists use. But again, diagnoses provided are entirely speculative and provisional and in no way reflect the actual diagnoses of the particular defendants in this case. Without further delay, let's move on from the appetizers to the main course.
We give you part 2.
Let's start bringing some of this together then. I hope now we have some sense of how and why Lori developed some of her extreme beliefs in her family and her family culture, that in many ways her extreme religious beliefs were a defense mechanism against the pain and trauma of her childhood. And because the negative experiences in her life seemed to continue to accumulate, that her beliefs continued to become more extreme. In episode 12, we looked at the way in which Chad was creating this fantasy of Lori as the ideal Mormon woman, as his goddess that he would take into the New Jerusalem. We can turn the tables here and show how Lori was also developing this fantasy and had been developing this fantasy since childhood of somebody like Chad. The fact is that Chad doesn't really exist to Lori. What exists is a prophet or a spiritually divine human being that can express love to her, a love that she's never known, but can express love to her in a way that will become a panacea for her problems. It turns out that Chad is that person. The way Chad becomes that person is because Lori finds his books, we believe, around 2015.
Mm-hmm.
She throws herself into his books. She's also come across Julie Rowe's books around the same time.
Right. She's read Julie Rowe's books.
Julie Rowe starts publishing through Chad around 2014, but Chad has been writing his books since 1999.
Mm-hmm.
So Lori goes back to all of Chad's books. As far as we can tell, she starts reading them around 2015. So what's going on is that Lori is now becoming a lot like Spencer, that Spencer is creating this obsessive fantasy of the way in which Katy Perry loves him. Lori, similarly, is starting to create this fantasy of the ideal man who, in her mind's eye, could be a prophet. And I think she's starting to believe, based upon her readings of Chad's books, that Chad is that person.
And she's also, without knowing Chad, a little starstruck.
someone that's special among her circle, an author. In fact, on that first welfare check with JJ, when the police officers are debating who Chad Daybell is, Chad Daybell, I've heard that name. Lori's quick to say, he's an author. Although the policemen were actually thinking, isn't that the guy whose wife just died? Lori's response is, he's an author. She's starstruck. She's starstruck that this man is a published author.
Chad the Daybell?
He's an author.
He's not the Chad Bell that his wife passed away recently.
There's a little bit of fangirling going on here. I think this becomes really interesting when Lori meets Chad in 2018 at a Preparing the People conference. Shortly after Lori meets Chad, we have good reasons to believe that Lori's parents and her sister Summer all attended a Preparing the People conference.
Yes, and this rumor was recently discussed in a recorded conversation between Lori's sister Summer and prosecutor Rob Wood. Summer did say she attended a conference. So I think we can safely say that is true now.
And what is really interesting to me about that dynamic is that her father is there.
Right.
With Chad Daybell.
Right.
It's not unreasonable to think that her father actually blessed that relationship with Chad Daybell, or if he didn't bless it, he at least showed some approval of Chad Daybell.
He likely admired Chad Daybell.
And Barry, as far as we can tell, really didn't have a tremendous amount of admiration for any of Lori's previous husbands.
We know this because when Janice and Summer are interviewed on national television, they rave about Lori. They are there defending Lori, that she is a wonderful mother, a wonderful sister, a wonderful woman, a wonderful daughter, but they have one complaint about Lori, and that is the men she chooses.
We really think that she did nothing wrong. She's had some bad judgment. She's married a few men that we didn't care for.
And she'll be the first to say that she's made a lot of mistakes and she's paid high prices for those mistakes.
If Lori is attempting to gain acceptance from her family, and in this area she is failing, she would very much want her father and her parents to give their blessing. She would want to make sure that her dad approved of Chad Daybell.
And it appears as if he does approve of Chad Daybell, and he does know about Chad's writings.
Summer tells us in this interview she's met Chad.
I don't know Chad very well. I've only met him one time. I've never heard anything about him self-proclaiming to be a prophet or anything else of that nature, or trying to get people to follow him. But if somebody chooses to do that on their own, that's their choice.
This is where, to me, we're going to start uncovering what's most hidden with Lori Vallow Daybell. Psychologists often talk about what's called the transference neurosis. That was a Freudian term. Nowadays, we just call it the transference. But the transference is a mental representation that we've developed often since we were children. We develop these mental representations of others at a very early age. And so our strongest mental representations, or sometimes we call them identifications, are with our parents, our mother or our father, or both, most likely. But we develop these representations of our parents that we then carry with us throughout life. And these representations are important because the word transference suggests to transfer, that we tend to take these representations and transfer them onto other people. For example, with Lori, part of her transference is taking some representations of her father and bringing them into her relationship with men. We know that Lori has had some very unhealthy relationship with men. She claims that some of those relationships were abusive, and this would make sense because Barry could have been abusive, and this is what she knows. I'm not suggesting that that's right or justified. Abuse never is, but what I'm suggesting is that there was a certain comfort level with the transference of her father, Barry, that she was in these relationships because that was the representation she knew the best. Here, we have a situation where Lori finally meets Chad. She's developed this fantasy of Chad over 4 or 5 years from reading his books. She likely has a very conflicted relationship with her father that she's had since she was a little girl. And now her father is giving his approval of Chad Daybell. This must seem like an epiphanal moment to Lori, I think, because it's probably the first time that her father has approved of someone that she's interested in, and not only approved of him, but she sees him as a type of ideal man.
Well, never mind that they're both still married. I mean, is it just enough that her dad might have liked Chad in general? Is that what you mean by a blessing? Or are you saying that he might have actually known about the affair?
I think I'm referring to the fact that Barry more than likely thought Chad was a genuinely spiritual person and quite possibly a prophet who could have a very positive influence on his daughter's life.
Okay, that makes sense.
Not blessing an affair, no, just seeing Chad as someone who would be good for his daughter and letting his daughter do the rest.
Take the reins.
letting his daughter take the interpretation of his positive thoughts about Chad to whatever
portal she wants to head to.
Right.
If Lori has such a complicated relationship with her father, why would she care so much what he thought? Why would she want to marry someone that he approved of?
Even though she finds a certain amount of comfort in attaching to men who occupy very traditionally masculine roles, ultimately her dream is to resolve those early childhood conflicts.
Those lucky guys. Well, I also want to throw out that Lori seems to also abuse her husbands. I've read a lot of evidence from court docs that show this.
While I don't disagree with that, I think that what I'm looking at here is Lori's mental representations of men, not necessarily the way she has treated them, although that's an interesting topic in and of itself. It's unlikely that Lori challenged or tried to push back or abuse her father. And so her mental representations, at least her earliest mental representations of men, tend to be with a parental figure who is dominant, traditionally masculine, and even in some cases, possibly abusive. Her dream is to find a man who can help her overcome and heal from all of her childhood traumas. In other words, she wants to find a man like her father, but someone who can make her whole, that like her father, but someone who can mend all those childhood wounds through her affiliation with that person. It's a bit of a paradox. She wants to find someone like her father, but someone who can go beyond her father and help heal her past traumas in a way that her father never could or can.
Or in other words, someone just like her father, but who will love her and who will be who she always wanted her father to be, to fill that wholeness.
Yeah, exactly. Psychologists sometimes call that object mastery, that as we go through a number of difficulties or traumas in childhood or even into adulthood, that we try to overcome those traumas by returning to them and trying to master the emotions and the thoughts and the behaviors surrounding some of those traumas. And the best way to do that is to find an object. That's not quite the right term, but that's what psychologists say. An object is typically a person. To find a person or object who can help us revisit those past obstacles.
And that would be Chad Daybell for Lori Vallow.
Yes, exactly. Chad is someone who is receiving her father's blessing. He's extremely religious, like her father. He was born and raised in the Mormon faith. He was a returned missionary. And unlike
many of Lori's previous husbands, he was not a convert to the church.
Although I have to say, being a convert's pretty good. Lori converting these men? I mean, I haven't been able to do it.
Sometimes it's a tough sell.
But yes, you're right. He was a return missionary. He came from a long line of Mormon pioneers. Chad did.
He has written books that her father presumably has read and admires. It's a perfect setup for Lori to engage in this process of object mastery to overcome all of these childhood difficulties.
So then what went wrong? Because we all know a lot did.
I think it's one thing to desire to overcome your past traumas, and it's another thing altogether to do it in a healthy fashion. So obviously the doing here was a little more difficult. Here's the problem. Lori doesn't feel, which means she doesn't feel love.
You know who else didn't seem to feel, according to some witnesses who knew Muhammad Atta? Listen to this.
The reason I think that I remember him the most was his eyes. When he would look at you as if he was looking directly through you. There was no emotion in him at all.
Many people that knew Muhammad Atta seemed to describe his eyes as emotionless and blank. That seemed to be a very consistent feature of many people that ran into him.
But as you say, Lori doesn't feel. She doesn't know what love is. She can't feel love.
She doesn't feel connected to the things she supposedly values and believes the most, which are these religious beliefs. That although those beliefs are extreme, they don't help her to actually interact with real human beings in the real world. Love is much more complicated than simply adhering to some abstraction of love that a so-called prophet like Chad Daybell is going to bring into your life.
Okay.
This is where it's easier to understand how and why Lori could condone murdering her children, because love to her is not a real flesh and blood emotion. It's an abstraction. It's something she doesn't really feel or understand.
When you say an abstraction, what do you mean?
Katy Perry is an abstraction to Spencer. He can't possibly know what a relationship with Katy Perry would be like because he's never been in that relationship.
Right.
In other words, if he were in a relationship with Katy Perry, hypothetically, let's say he was in a relationship with her. Like every relationship, there would be conflict, and there would be fights, and there would be disagreements, and there would be compromise. And of course, there would probably be good moments too. But love is not just about perfection and bliss all the time.
Are you sure?
How about sometimes bliss?
Mostly?
70%? Point is, I think Lori had some of those experiences with her kids, but I think she also ran away from that. I think that she didn't really know how to love those children.
Clearly.
We've always speculated that Chad was the one who asked her to murder the kids. I don't think it was that difficult for her because love to her wasn't something real. It was otherworldly.
So in other words, she kills for love with Chad Daybell, yet she's able to kill her children because she doesn't love them.
The love she craves is a love not of this world.
After I've had this washing over of the Lord, who gave me all of his complete love, all of his peace, which is not of this world.
So I think it's easier for her to be unemotional and detached about murder because she doesn't know what real flesh and blood love is. Let's listen to Muhammad Atta talking to the air traffic controllers just before crashing into the North Tower of the World Trade Centers.
Yes, this is what we played at the beginning of our episode. Let's listen to it again.
We have some planes, just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We're turning to the airport.
And who's trying to call me here? American 11, are you trying to call?
Nobody move. Everything will be okay. okay. If you try to make any move, you'll danger yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet.
So he's telling everyone to just stay calm, even though they're all about to die.
Similarly to Lori being detached, I think what really stands out here is Atta also being detached. He's trying to project a certain amount of calm. He's asking people to remain quiet. He's showing no emotion when several minutes after this, he will be hurling a plane into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. I think the reason he is able to maintain so much equanimity is because he is thinking about the outcome. And the outcome is this immortal ideal love where he will be reunified with God or Allah. And so he's calm. He's detached. He's not in the moment. He doesn't care about sacrificing thousands of human beings. He only cares about his larger vision of peace and reunion with God the Father.
So in other words, just what you said about Lori, he doesn't care or doesn't understand what real flesh and blood love is. So he doesn't care about these people on this plane that are all about to die, and the thousands of people in the towers that are all about to die.
Right. He's connecting to a larger sense of some ideal love, just as Lori is trying to connect to that. He's not connected to the human beings in the airplane or the human beings in the towers. He's detached from that. He's indifferent to that. His only concern is getting to heaven or getting to that reunion with Allah.
For Lori, it seems like her big concern is being with Chad Daybell. Does she not know that she's not going to receive that type of love from Chad Daybell? I mean, it's not even something, as you say, that she can understand on Earth.
Chad Daybell is a means to an end. Her larger vision with Chad Daybell is a vision of them in the post-apocalypse. It's a vision of them as God and Goddess in the New Jerusalem leading the new world. So I think even with Chad Daybell, I think he's a means to an end, just as crashing a plane into the World Trade Center is a means to an end for Muhammad Atta.
She doesn't know that she's not going to receive that from Chad Daybell, that her love is not even something that she can understand.
Let's take this even a step further. Chad represents an ideal to her. It's an ideal that will allow her to overcome all of her past wounds and all of her past hurts from her father. That Chad, in many ways, will become a stand-in and a fantasy figure for her. He'll become the father she always desired. He'll become her salvation. The Chad is also this abstraction of love. It's the love she wanted to get from her father, but never did. So Chad becomes the symbolic representation of everything Lori has desired from her father, but never received. Murder for her, ironically, I think for Lori, murder becomes an expression of love, but a really dysfunctional, distorted, abstract version of love that she doesn't understand. And I would even go a step further than that and say there's almost this mystical, transcendental type of love she's seeking here. She talks about merging with Jesus. She talks about it in the Melanie Gibb call, and she talks about it in the murder tape. What she wants is a love that doesn't exist. She wants almost a mythological type of love. She wants to merge with a mythical version of the Father. And that mythical version of the Father, which she sought her whole life, and she's created this fantasy of through Chad's books, is now presenting itself to her when she meets Chad Daybell. Ironically, Muhammad Atta on 9/11 said something very similar when he left behind a letter the day of the 9/11 massacre.
And you know, I didn't even know he had left a letter behind until you shared this with me recently.
When I did some of the research on terrorists a few episodes ago, I came across this letter, and it was fascinating to me because you would think that in that letter, Muhammad Atta would be angry towards the Western infidels that are impinging upon the Middle East's values and way of life. But he doesn't. In fact, in his letter, he doesn't mention that at all. What he talks about is how blissful it will be to return to a reunion with God.
Take a listen to this.
Purify your soul from all blemishes. Completely forget something called this world. The time for play is over, and the serious time is upon us. How much time have we wasted in our lives? Shouldn't we take advantage of these last hours to offer sacrifices and obedience? You should feel complete tranquility, because the time between you and your marriage in heaven is very short. Afterward begins the happy life, where God is satisfied with you, and eternal bliss in the company of prophets, the companions, the martyrs, the good people who are the best company.
Just as Muhammad Atta has no regard whatsoever for the 3,000 living, breathing human beings inside the World Trade Centers, because he sees them as expendable when compared to the bliss and transcendence he will experience after he dies, when he finds, as he says, tranquility in the afterlife.
You should feel complete tranquility, because the time between you and your marriage in heaven is very short. Afterward begins the happy life.
I think something similar is going on with Lori, that her children are expendable in the service of her larger vision of a reunion with Jesus Christ.
The time is now. The Lord is gathering his people. He is calling people to the 144,000. They're already being called. They're already being sent on their missions. They're already going full circle. The time is now. He is coming. He is preparing us. And we promised we would do it.
The time for play is over.
The time is now.
The time between you and your marriage in heaven is very short.
The time is now. He is coming.
Afterward begins the happy life. You should feel complete tranquility.
All of his complete love, all of his peace, which is not of this world.
Let me take a moment here to review some of the research on terrorist psychology and how Lori and Muhammad Atta actually share many common characteristics. I'm going to cite a research article by Jeff Victoroff from 2005. This is in the Journal of Conflict Resolution. Victoroff provides a quick summary of some of the, quote, typical psychological characteristics of terrorists. He finds 4 of those characteristics. They are, number 1, high affective valence regarding an ideological issue. So this, as we talked about in our last episode, is what I called hot cognition. This is about being very emotionally attached to one's beliefs, and in this particular case, extreme beliefs. Victoroff refers to this as ideological beliefs. So for Atta, the ideology is obviously jihad or Muslim fundamentalism. For Lori, the ideology is deeply conservative and fundamental Mormon beliefs with a constant apocalyptic vision of the future that she believes will transpire. And by the way, this is the point at which we can get Spencer off the bus, because Spencer does not see love in this context. Spencer does not situate love within the context of larger ideology, as Victoroff points out. So Spencer is actually not going to fall into this category of a terrorist. He is more lovesick and simply using love as a means to feel special and to probably overcome some of his childhood hurts. Whereas Lori and Muhammad Atta are using love to realize this larger ideological worldview. The second element in the mind of a terrorist, according to Victoroff, is some type of personal stake. He describes this as, quote, an extraordinary need for identity, glory, or vengeance that distinguishes him or her from the vast majority of those who fulfill the first characteristic. And again, I think this would apply to Lori and Atta both. For Atta, part of his mission here is to become a martyr, which appears to have been realized after this horrendous tragedy. For Lori too, this is part of her identity. This is part of her vision of herself as a goddess in the New Jerusalem. It is, like for Atta, it involves a certain amount of glory. And that also involves Chad. The Chad is the prophet who will walk hand in hand with Lori into this new world. And so both of them are heavily invested in this notion of what Viktorov refers to as a personal stake. The third element that Viktorov identifies in the mind of a terrorist is, quote, low cognitive flexibility, low tolerance for ambiguity, and elevated tendency towards attribution error. Translation, this means being closed-minded. We've talked about this previously. I mentioned this in the research in the book, Engineers of Jihad, where he pointed out perhaps the most important and salient characteristic of terrorist psychology was what he called need for closure. That's exactly what Viktorov is talking about here. And so Atta and Lori, again, both fit this very, very closely, that neither of them are able to sustain enough cognitive flexibility or curiosity or to see enough differing perspectives to stand outside of their ideology and their worldview and to question their beliefs. And so they become trapped in these very narrow perspectives of the world that they simply can't overcome. And so because of that, their actions are much more likely to become extreme. This is really important because as much as we've talked about belief forming in the family and developing in the family, which is a nurturance issue, now we're getting into belief as a function of one's personality. This idea of need for closure is actually more of a personality trait. So it's more genetic. It's more characteristic of one's personality from a very early age. And so I think Muhammad Atta and Lori both share this personality trait. When you combine this with all of the elements we talked about in our last episode, in terms of extreme beliefs in a family culture that's chaotic and the confirmation bias and all these other elements that play into developing extreme beliefs, this kind of seals the deal. This is the nail in the coffin. If you have someone like Lori who grows up in a home that's very extreme and chaotic, and there's this propensity towards dealing with that chaos through developing very rigid and extreme beliefs, and then you have this personality trait of closed-mindedness, it's going to be very hard to overcome that. And in fact, that's what happens here with both Atta and Lori. The results are extreme. They're unable to surmount their very narrow and limited views of the world. That would be common of most terrorists. And that's certainly true here. And again, Spencer doesn't seem to have this need for closure so much. This is what would distinguish him from a typical terrorist. Spencer is someone who is gullible and probably suggestible to some degree, and he's easy prey for someone seeking to catfish him, as we know, and that he fell into this very easily. But he's no terrorist. He's not capable of taking that final step of murdering or harming other human beings, I don't believe, because he's not immersed in this larger ideological vision of the world and how it should be, and he doesn't harbor these fantasies of post-apocalyptic transcendence and reunion with God or a higher being.
Taking all of that in, thank you for sharing all of that.
The best way I can conceptualize this type of love would be to call it immortal love. By calling it immortal love, it's clear that any other type of love, any love that's comprised of mere flesh and bones is not going to have the same force or effect as the immortal love she seeks. So ironically, I think this is what Lori's after. She's after this mythical reunion with, in this case, God the Father. God the Father becomes a symbolic stand-in for her dad and for Chad Daybell. It's no irony that Chad Daybell says, I testify all the time.
All the time.
Testify. I just want to testify. They testify. I want to testify.
And by the way, when people say, oh, all Mormons say that,
I just want to testify.
I can say, no, they do not. Do you hear that from Mormon authority figures and leaders during sermons? Yes, it's during an event, an important religious event, that you might hear that from the pulpit, from the prophet or an apostle or an authority figure. You do not hear that in common everyday language. That is not said in regular daily conversation. Chad's use of I testify is unusual.
It's also no irony that her father says, I testify. In fact, let's listen to some of his statements from his letter to the courts defending his son, Alex Cox.
My testimony is that Joseph Ryan, who was married to my daughter, Lori Ryan Ballow, imagined the facts.
This is a document we received from Cheryl Wheeler. Cheryl Wheeler is Charles Vallow's ex-husband, Lori's husband that was shot dead. Cheryl sent us this letter written by Barry Cox. It was addressed to the court when his son, Alex Cox, Lori's brother, was being sentenced for assaulting Lori's ex-husband, Joe Ryan. Barry is requesting that the judge give Alex a lighter sentence.
My testimony is that Joseph Ryan, who was married to my daughter, Lori Ryan Ballow, imagined the facts and misled the security guard. My testimony is that Joseph Ryan, what
are your thoughts on this letter? I would call it pompous.
Yeah, it's super pompous. It shows Barry's sense of self-importance and his belief that he's speaking as a higher authority. When you qualify a statement with my testimony or I testify, you're essentially invoking
authority.
Right. You're invoking a higher authority, or you're citing yourself as that authority.
It's pompous and self-important, which is both Chad and Barry. It's very similar.
Right. Exactly. That's why they're speaking the same language. When I go to the grocery store and buy some kimchi,
He bought
when
kimchi.
I go to the grocery
He bought
store,
kimchi at the grocery store yesterday. That's true.
when I check out and the person asks me, did you find everything you need? I don't say, I testify that I did. I think it's just taken for granted that the answer is, yes, I did. Thank you.
Or better yet, let's talk about when you speak in court. You don't get up there and say, I testify, or my testimony is.
Right. No, I make it clear I'm expressing my opinion. I'm not speaking for a higher authority than myself. I have never once said in court, I testify that what I'm saying is true. I think a similarity is that both Chad and Barry use a very similar dialectic, that they both invoke this idea of testimony or testifying, which is unique. It's different. It's a commonality that they share that I think must have appealed at some deeper level to Lori. Their similarity of language and using the word testify and testimony shows that they think similarly, that they both have extreme views of the world, that they're both in some ways religious zealots. They both have a sense of entitlement. They both have narcissistic qualities. They're both dominant, at least within their families. They have dominant views of the world. They are both interested in power and assuming power over different entities, including the government or the IRS. There are many, many parallels between Barry and Chad that Lori, I'm sure, finds appealing. So it's not just the similarities between Barry and Chad that Lori finds appealing. It's the fact that Barry and Chad represent this transcendent love that's unobtainable, that's calling her to wash away all of her sins and all of her pains and all of her traumas from the past, so that when Chad Daybell, who claims to be a prophet and who represents exactly this kind of love that Lori is seeking, when he asks her to murder her children, which seems highly probable, she finds that request to be more compelling than the survival of her kids, because her kids don't provide her with the kind of transcendent love that Chad and Jesus and this apocalyptic vision of the future offers her. When I think about this, I'm actually reminded to some degree of the Twilight series by Stephanie Meyer. We have some indication that Lori has read the Twilight books and is familiar with them. It's interesting to think of it in this context, because in many ways, Chad is similar to Edward in the Twilight books, in the sense that Edward is immortal. He is otherworldly in the sense that he's a vampire. He's not human.
Unattainable.
Unobtainable. I'm not sure there's much difference between a vampire offering you the promise of immortal love and a prophet who is offering you the vision of an apocalyptic world where you, like Edward, if you happen to be Edward's love interest, will occupy a very prominent and powerful place in that immortal life. If we try to look for what's really hidden in the case of Lori, I think we find that Lori murders for love, but it's a love that's abstract and mystical and transcendent and not of this world, which is to say, it's a love that in many ways isn't real human love to begin with. I want to read a quote by William Butler Yeats from Meditations in Time of Civil War. Yeats said, "We had fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair." What Yeats meant was that fantasy, in the absence of something real, can take on a life of its own, and often a life that can lead us to treacherous behaviors and to dark places. And that actually reminds me of an episode of Dexter.
Dexter, catfish, we got them all tonight.
This is from the episode called An Inconvenient Lie. It's season 2, episode 3. This is a quote from Dexter.
"I'm Dexter, and I'm not sure what I am.
Hi, Dexter.
I just know there's something dark in me. I hide it. I certainly don't talk about it, but it's there. Always. This dark passenger. And when he's driving, I feel alive. Half sick with the thrill, the complete wrongness. I don't fight him. I don't want to. He's all I've got. Nothing else could love me. Not even, especially not me.
When I remembered that quote from Dexter many years ago, it stood out because it suggests that those darker parts of ourselves, even though we don't want to acknowledge them, sometimes those are the parts we know the best. Sometimes we think that those parts of us are the most lovable parts, oddly. And when I think of this, I think it has tremendous applicability to Lori. I think if you dig even deeper with Lori, if we go beyond this notion of transcendent love, what you'll find is a lot of self-hatred. The dark passenger for Lori is her self-hatred. The dark passenger for Lori is this part of her that she detests that she doesn't want to acknowledge, that's capable of murder, that says that in her testimony.
Well, listen to this. Listen, again, we've played this soundbite before. This is what Lori has to say about the devil.
And Satan had been torturing me since I was a little kid. So I've had that my whole life.
This statement is an important moment for Lori because we have to assume that the devil, as some external entity, is not following her around. Therefore, the implications of this statement are that Lori is internalizing the sense of the devil, that she's actually seeing the devil as a part of herself that's closely aligned with who she is. It's very much like Dexter's Dark Passenger. This would be, I think, about as close as we can get to Lori telling us that she's filled with self-hatred.
And Satan had been torturing me since I was a little kid. So I've had that my whole life.
She sees the devil as inescapably tied to who she is. It's very much like Dexter's Dark Passenger. And that, as Dexter said,
Dark passenger. And when he's driving, I feel alive. I don't fight him. I don't want to. He's all I've got. Nothing else could love me. Not even me.
And Satan had been torturing me since I was a little kid. So I've had that my whole life.
she can't let go of it because it's the only part of her that loves her. It's the part she knows the best, even though she won't acknowledge that.
But what about those who are Christian and believe in the devil and the devil tempting them? Christians will talk about some people having bigger struggles than others, and it's the devil tempting us.
Right. I think they're talking about the devil in the same way that Lori is here. They're talking about the devil as a part of themselves. They're talking about the devil as a competing faction to their good side, that the devil represents temptation or maybe malevolence or certain behaviors or thoughts or actions that we don't want to engage in. And so we have to resist those, or we try to resist those. It's still a reflection on an internal struggle.
Sort of like those Looney Tune cartoons where you've got the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other. So what you're saying is those people that really struggle with the devil or are believing they struggle with the devil, there's self-hatred or shame.
They're using the devil as a metaphor for an external entity, but in fact, the devil in these cases would be in their mind. It's a psychological state. So yes, it is something like shame or self-hatred or humiliation. It could be a number of negative emotional states that people struggle with. And so they recognize that, and their goal is to try to overcome that.
Okay. I'm never going to see a Looney Tunes cartoon the same way again.
Beyond this notion of love for Lori is this notion of love as self-hatred, love of the Dexter variety. The dark passenger is the part of him he can't let go of because it's the part he can count on, the part that he knows will love him no matter what. That's Lori Fallow Daybell. It's all self-hatred. It's all based on the idea that she, like Dexter, has a good deal of psychopathy. She doesn't feel. She's capable of rage, and she's capable of murder. That's the part that she connects to the best.
Since we asked this about Chad, I have to ask it with Lori. Would you say that because Lori essentially murdered for love and self-hatred, if you dig deep enough, that's what she murdered for, would you say that Lori is evil?
It's interesting you asked that question because we had one of our listeners essentially say that we probably could have saved a lot of time and energy if we just came to the conclusion that Lori was evil from the start. End of story, hard stop.
Boom. And
Right.
I think that most podcasts that aren't us would say that. If you want to go listen to all those others, that's what you're going to hear.
Right. So we hope you haven't wasted your time by listening to us, because perhaps we could have said in the first 5 minutes of our first podcast that Lori was evil and be done with everything else. But here we are. We've spent hours on this podcast, And now we're going to have to grapple with this question of whether Lori is evil in a way that won't be as reductive or simplistic as Dorner's idea of horizontal flight. In other words, I don't think we're going to say she's evil, hard stop, good night, drive safely, thanks for coming.
No, we're the hidden podcast. That's not what we're going to do.
There's a book called Humanity's Dark Side. In that book, there's an essay by a psychologist by the name of Peter Schmidt. The essay is called Whence the Evil, a Personalistic and Dialogic Perspective. Here's what Schmidt says about evil. Quote, evil is opposition to love. Therefore, and with all due cautiousness and carefulness because of the multiple meanings of the word love, evil is the failure to love oneself and the other. To love is used here in the meaning of agape, which refers to unconditional positive regard. Schmidt goes on, quote, it is evil to deprive oneself and others of respect, regard, and acknowledgement as a person. It is evil to withhold love towards oneself and others, unquote. So what he's saying is that evil is the opposition of love, the opposite of love.
Right. Help me understand what you mean by her self-hatred, because really all the public sees, what I see is this overindulgent self-infatuation.
I think it's important to recognize that in the story of Narcissus, and we talked about this in one of our earlier episodes, that when Narcissus looks into the lake at his reflection, all he sees is his image. There's no substance behind that image. So self-infatuation in some ways is looking into the mirror and looking at nothing else, that there's no substance. To have self-esteem means to have some sense of who we are and to have some substance behind the image. If she's smitten or infatuated with herself, that doesn't suggest that she has a lot of self-esteem. Her self-hatred is more than likely a function of a childhood that was abusive or neglectful or traumatic, and the message she received consistently, I would imagine, would have been that she wasn't lovable. Self-hatred is born from that feeling of unlovability, which is ironic, again, because Lori, more so than anything else, wants this type of mystical and mythical love that she can never seem to find. And yet, because of her inability to express and feel that kind of love, or real love, I should say, the inability to truly connect to others in a loving, meaningful way, this would suggest, according to Schmidt at least, that she is evil. And if we look at her self-hatred, he says that her inability to love herself is also potentially a form of evil. I don't necessarily agree with his perspective, but it's an interesting perspective.
I have friends with low self-esteem that aren't evil. Help me understand this.
I think what Schmidt is talking about here is the idea that self-hatred, in the absence of any self-regard, starts approaching something like evil. In other words, self-hatred without anything to counterbalance that is more than likely going to lead to aggression or violence or potentially evil acts.
And when you say counterbalance, you mean?
I mean that most of us have some shame and probably some self-hatred, or maybe some dislike of ourselves. Self-hatred would be an extreme. Most of us have that, but we also have some positive feelings about ourselves. We also have some positive self-regard. So there's a mixture, there's a balance. When he's talking about, he's referring to evil as the absence of self-regard, just pure self-hatred. Dexter would be an example of someone who is pure self-hatred, that there's no other forces that can counteract that self-hatred. He's acting from that place of pure self-hatred.
So when there's no self-regard whatsoever, that's when evil happens.
That's what Schmidt's arguing, that it's not just the absence of love. Evil is not the absence of love. Evil is closer to the complete absence of love and is driven by something that he would perceive to be self-hatred. I think that as we venture out into other cases, we're always going to return to this question of evil, because it's the question of crime. It's the question that crime forces us to answer. Are these people evil? And I think we're going to find multiple ways to answer that question. But I don't have an answer here about whether Lori's evil. I think this is an interesting perspective to consider that question. I think that for someone who wants love so desperately and struggles to fully feel and understand what love is, that it's a really fascinating way to consider the possibility of evil. Of course,
but does this go to the whole cliche, if you can't love yourself first, you'll never find love? I mean, is that what we're talking about?
I think there's some relationship there for sure, that the inability to love ourselves first definitely hinders us in expressing love towards others. I think we see that with Spencer in Catfish, that his need for some type of external love from someone who isn't available to him strongly suggests his struggles to really comfort and feel some positive regard towards himself. And I think we see something similar with Muhammad Atta. He's so intent upon realizing his goal of reunion with Allah that he's willing to lose himself in the process. So terrorism and destruction become secondary to his larger goals of becoming a martyr and realizing, to use his term, eternal bliss in the afterlife. Since we're talking about this idea of love and self-hatred and evil potentially as the opposite of love, many of you might be asking, well, John, so what is love? What is the kind of love that we should seek? And I'm going to end with a quote from the well-known famous psychologist Rollo May, who talked about love a great deal. May said, quote, "To love means to open ourselves to the negative as well as the positive, to grief, sorrow, and disappointment, as well as to joy, fulfillment, and an intensity of consciousness we did not know was possible before." And so I think what May is saying is that, number one, there's a complexity to love that we don't always anticipate, that certainly Spencer could never anticipate, and that Muhammad Atta could never possibly envision, and that Lori didn't anticipate with her children or with her relationships that always became disastrous in the end.
In other words, when Tylee became independent and opinionated,
and
JJ being rambunctious.
Well, and trying to negotiate a normal relationship with Joe Ryan or her previous two husbands.
Right.
That any type of normal, intimate relationship she struggled with. Rollo May points to the idea that love, like everything else in life, is complex and requires a capacity for self-sacrifice and forgiveness and giving and compromise and dealing with conflict and difference and tolerating frustration. And that's real. That's the real love. And the beauty of that kind of love, I think, that we can say is hopefully
hopefully
is that it grows deeper over time.
Absolutely.
Even though there might be rifts and conflicts in a relationship, that with enough love and healthy communication, those are overcome, and that you become closer to someone through those types of interactions. The goal isn't to avoid those situations. The goal is to embrace them.
I think you said something really important. I think even in the therapy world, we assume that all conflict is bad. I know a therapist specifically who's afraid of any conflict, that if she has conflict in her marriage, it means something's wrong with their marriage. And you're saying that love can go stronger through the grief and through the moments that aren't perfect.
Yeah, through differences. That's real. That's what makes a relationship real. It's one thing to date someone and have minimal interactions with them and to experience all these romantic feelings, but that's not the real relationship. That's not real love. I think real love is built upon a foundation of nurturance and caring and empathy and understanding and compassion, but also the willingness to compromise and to tolerate differences and to respect other opinions. I think that's the place from which relationships deepen. And I don't think that's the place that Lori Vallow Daybell was willing to go or even consider going, that her version of love was an empty abstraction that kept her from loving, ironically, because she wasn't willing to dig deep enough into the difficulties and complexities of a real relationship. I want to tell a story about an experience I had several years ago when I visited a prison to see an inmate who was a very powerful inmate at the time, in the sense that he more or less ran the prison block where he was residing. He had a long history of violence. I was sent in to assess him by the DA to determine whether the possibility of parole would ever be an option on the table during his lifetime. I remember meeting him and sensing right away that he wasn't going to be cooperative. He made it clear that he didn't want to be there, that he didn't want to answer my questions. And then he did something that's rare. He shocked me. He said, essentially, "Hey, Doc, have you ever heard this quote from Nietzsche?" And I thought, okay, I probably know the Nietzsche quote because it's in the beginning of every FBI profiler's book. I'm very familiar with the quote, but okay, here we go. Let's hear it. He said the quote, and the quote goes like this: "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process, he does not become a monster. And if you stare long enough into the abyss will stare back into you." He quoted that Nietzsche quote, and he looked at me and he said, "Doc, I'm the monster you're most afraid of. I'm the monster who keeps you up at night. I am your biggest effing nightmare." And he said, "I want to let you know that I know where you live. I know where your family lives. And I know people on the outside who will do anything for this monster. And they'll do anything to frighten you. And they'll do anything to make sure that this evaluation is positive. And I want to let you know that if this evaluation isn't positive, that things may not turn out well for you." And so, of course, I've been threatened before in situations in prison, but this wasn't a particularly pleasant moment. I had a couple of options. I could have pressed the panic button and the guard would have come in, and I could have told the guard that I needed to talk to the DA. I could have told the DA that his inmate that I was evaluating had essentially threatened my life and my family's life. And of course, that would not have gone well for him, but I wouldn't have had to do the evaluation because it would have been very clear that he would never have a chance at probation or parole in the future. And more than likely, new charges would have been filed. So I paused for a moment and I did what I tend to do in these moments, which is to try to buy some time. And I leveraged the use of silence as much as I can in these situations. So I shut down and I didn't say anything for minutes. Probably seemed to him like hours, but to me, it was something like 5 minutes. And after a minute,
he started taunting me. He said, "Hey, Doc, what? Did the cat get your tongue? You too afraid to talk? Why can't you talk?" Of course, that just meant that I was going to spend a couple more minutes being silent. So I used the silence as leverage to show him that I wasn't going to be reactive and that I didn't need to make a rash decision. I didn't need to lunge towards the panic button to resolve the situation or to resolve my anxiety. I needed to buy some time. So I sat and I sat and I sat a little longer, and it was really uncomfortable because nothing was being said. But that also meant, and it showed him in a subtle way, that I was the one in control of the room, in spite of the fact that he was threatening me. So finally, I talked and I said, the DA sent me in here to determine if you will ever see the light of day on the other side of a prison wall for the rest of your life. I said, I don't have to be here. I made a decision to do this because I thought it might benefit you. I could press that button on the wall right now, and I can guarantee that you'll never, ever see the light of day, in spite of the fact that you just threatened to kill me and my family. But that's not how I perceive my role here. My job is to try to understand you as much as I can. My job is to be here to listen to your story and to try to help you. I know you don't see it that way, and I know you feel threatened, but truly, my job is really just understanding and listening and try to make sense of your life and what got you here in the first place. You're already showing me that you're afraid. You're already showing me how you operate by threatening me before I've even had a chance to talk to you.
Did you tell him that?
Yeah. I said, but it doesn't matter. I just want to listen to you, and I just want to try to understand you. So you have a choice. We can either stay here and you can, to the best of your ability, you can try to help me understand your life, or I can get up right now and I can push the button and we can end all of this really quickly. So my preference would be to stay and to listen and to help you make sense of your life and to really understand what you've gone through. But it's really up to you. So now he paused and looked at me, and he was sizing me up. He was trying to determine if I was going to, in fact, go for the panic button. I think what he was most accustomed to was someone in my position reacting immediately to the threat and leaving the room. But I didn't do that. So I think that created some trust. When he talked, he said, let's take this from the start. He said, I want to tell you my story. I don't know if I trust you, but I'm going to try, and I'm going to tell you my story. And I'm sorry if I threatened you. And so I spent the next 5 hours listening to his story, developing his trust. It was a tragic story, by the way. He was quite emotional at times. And by the end, he actually shook my hand and thanked me. I'm glad that I didn't overreact and that I stayed the course with him, because I think in the end, he deserved that. Why am I telling you this story? Carl Rogers is a well-known, famous psychologist who had this idea, what he called unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard is exactly what it says, is exactly what the term suggests, which is treating people with respect, understanding, and acceptance. It's the closest thing I think that the field of therapy and psychology has to something like love.
Unconditional positive regard is truly embracing and accepting another human being in spite of what they've done, or maybe because of it, and still trying to see the best in them, still trying to understand them, to unconditionally accept them. As a forensic psychologist, in a situation like that, my job was to do exactly that. It was to stay the course, not overreact, and try to treat this inmate with unconditional positive regard, in spite of the fact that he had just threatened me. Roger's idea of unconditional positive regard actually reminds me a lot of a Buddhist meditation called Mind Like Sky. The basic idea behind Mind Like Sky meditation is to perceive the mind as expansive and as large as the entire sky. And what does that mean? That means that the sky encompasses everything. The sky, in theory, sees everything, not literally, but we all exist, all of us human beings exist within the great expanse of an openness of the sky. And so the Buddhist idea is that love, in some ways, is like the mind as the sky, that it's embracing everything, it's accepting everything, both good and bad, both good and evil, and it's seeing that, all of it, as a part of life. Nothing more, nothing less. When I think of these ideas of unconditional positive regard and Mind Like Sky, that to me is in many ways how I perceive love. In terms of thinking about these ideas for the Daybell case, I was particularly moved by Larry Woodcock's statement when he went to visit JJ's grave and body the day after the body was discovered in June.
Yeah, right after they found the bodies.
He went over to say goodbye to JJ, and let's take a listen to what Larry said.
That's to see where JJ was. I'm sorry, I'm not coming in hostility in any way. I come with trying to be the peacemaker. And that's all I want. I just want to be a peacemaker. Let's all get along here. I'm sorry.
What's extraordinary about Larry's statement to me is this idea of unconditional positive regard or Mind Like Sky, that Larry is accepting both the murderer and the child in the same sentence. That Larry is showing this tremendous love for human beings in spite of the horrendous crime that's occurred, and in spite of the fact that his grandson was murdered. That Larry is demonstrating love in this moment in a way that few of us can probably comprehend. But I think Larry has a lesson here to teach all of us.
In the article where they shared that clip on Fox 13, in Salt Lake City's Fox 13, he said that he hoped that he could one day talk to and be friends with the Daybell children. The house, that was there in front of the place where JJ was buried. You're right.
And so what is love? Although I don't have a great answer for that, and perhaps my answer would change, it's certainly not the abstract, empty version of love that Lori Vallow Daybell seeks. I think love to me is embracing the entire mess and depth and breadth of what human beings are capable of, both good and bad, both hopeful and despairing, both imperfect and transcendent. And to me, that's what we should aspire to, that type of human love.
Thank you all for your patience while we got this episode out. We are still here. We are still planning season 2, and we will still bring you some more episodes on the Daybell case. While everyone was waiting for part 2 to come out this episode, it takes teamwork. It's hard. We're both working, both parenting. So while we were waiting for that time, we were able to get this done.
we decided to divide forces, and I put out a couple of YouTube videos on our YouTube channel, Hidden True Crime. One of those was an interview that had been posted to Patreon for a few months. For our Patreon supporters, we decided to share it publicly because Mary Tracy, friend of Alex Cox, shared some really interesting things that had never been shared publicly before in an hour-long interview, and we put that raw interview up for anyone to watch. In addition, we've put a couple of videos up, some things that Lori Vallow, Daybell's neighbor, told us. Head to our YouTube channel, subscribe, and take a listen there. While these podcast episodes are being created, we'll work to continue to put out content and information on our YouTube channel.
I want to thank all of our listeners for your comments and wonderful feedback. I want to actually read one of our Apple reviews, which was quite touching. This is from an Apple review.
Actually, I'm going to read it because you don't have your glasses on, and we know what that means. This was left February 28th, 2021. Thank you for looking at the deeper meaning behind a complex situation. I have had 2 family members mixed up in a similar breakoff of this cult, and it has destroyed our family. This podcast has given me a sense of peace that this has been going on our entire lives. We have been slowly groomed to accept this as normal behavior. All of the therapy I have had has not had the impact this podcast has had on me. I am grateful.
We don't know who wrote this, but these types of comments mean so much to us, and they inspire us, and they really motivate us to keep going. So thank you very much. That means a lot to us. It means a lot to me. I'm glad that we could help in some small measure and that we provided a bit of insight that has been useful to you. I'm always humbled to receive comments like this that speak to the impact of our podcast. So thank you.
Yes, and if anyone has left us kind comments on Facebook or Instagram or any other social media, first off, thank you. We do read those. We're very grateful for them. But if you wouldn't mind going to Apple Podcasts and attempting to leave a review there, if you could. Those comments help us. They help us climb in the Apple Podcast rankings, which is difficult, which is needed as we try to continue this and hope to find sponsors one day. Until then, we are so grateful for the support of our listeners. We hear you. You tell us to keep going, and we have plans to keep going. So thank you for your support and for your kind reviews. Oh, and exciting news. We might be having guests with us to dinner soon. If so, we'll be bringing you that podcast episode soon.
Yes, we're really excited to be inviting some special and honored guests, and we will be quite honored to invite them to dinner. We hope you'll join us for this special episode. Don't forget to stay safe.
Wear that helmet.
And please, I urge you, do not at any cost or in any circumstance venture into portals.
I'm still waiting for one good portal experience. Someone say, no, I went and it was terrific. I don't think that will ever happen.
To me, the portal is a metaphor for getting completely lost in life and in the paranormal. And I think a lot of bad things happen in portals. So please stay out of portals.
Beyond staying out of portals, I think we should add something new. We all need to make sure we're not dating Katy Perry.
Sometimes in the Fias household, we like to say, be careful, or you might start dating Katy Perry.
Or I might look at John and be like, are you dating Katy Perry right now? Is that what you're doing? Is what this is? Although it's usually me who's dating Katy Perry. But we keep each other in check.
If you believe that you can jump into a portal and be transported to Hawaii instantaneously, you're probably dating Katy Perry.
Exactly.
Stay out of portals, and remember, don't date Katy Perry. It probably won't work out well.
Well, if you really are dating Katy Perry, please reach out, because I would love to talk to Orlando Bloom.
Say more.
And if you're not Orlando Bloom, and you think you're dating Katy Perry, reach out and we'll let you know that you're living in a fantasy world, along with people who think that they can jump into portals.
Maybe if you jump into a portal, you can discover Katy Perry on the other end.
No, I would say definitely do not get in that portal. To remind everyone, we have started a YouTube channel, Hidden True Crime. We want to again thank Dan McCauley from Boise, Idaho, who has helped us with several voiceovers now. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/hidden true crime, and our Instagram is instagram.com/hidden true crime.
Stay safe and wear a helmet. Don't go into portals.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Hidden, a true crime podcast. A forensic psychologist and a journalist explore the hidden motives behind unthinkable crimes while examining our deepest fears along the way. Thank you for your patience. Season 1 is not over, far from. And this bonus episode, this interview I'm about to share, will help transition